Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Long before maps defined the edges of our world, a vast and silent network of pathways quietly knit the continents together, driven not by a single grand design, but by the persistent curiosity of human commerce. If you find value in these long, unhurried accounts of our shared past, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. These small actions support our weekly publications and help ensure these histories continue to find their place in the quiet hours. The story of the Silk Road is less about a single highway and more about the slow, organic accumulation of water stops, mountain passes, and desert outposts that gradually eroded the isolation of ancient civilizations. It is a chronicle of fragile things, soft textiles, ideas, and paper scraps, outlasting the massive stone empires that sought to control them. The history opens where the first deliberate tracks were pressed into the frontier sand. Chapter 1: The Jade Gate and the Western Horizon. Beyond the westernmost bends of the Yellow River, the land changes its character with an unhurried certainty, rising into the high, arid plains that separate the fertile river valleys of central China from the vast interior of Asia. This frontier zone, known historically as the Hexi Corridor, formed a narrow shelf of arable soil pinned between the cold massifs of the Kilian Mountains and the dry expanses of the Gobi Desert. For centuries, the stability of the early Han Dynasty depended heavily on maintaining a fragile equilibrium along this geographic corridor. The seasonal shifts of the northern grasslands brought agrarian communities into frequent, unpredictable contact with pastoral groups whose movements were governed by the search for pasture. Consequently, the imperial administration in Chang'an viewed this western horizon not as an open door for trade, but as a space of chronic vulnerability requiring constant vigilance. Recognizing the strategic necessity of protecting these agrarian settlements, the Han court under early emperors focused primarily on consolidation rather than outward movement. The construction of earthworks and beacon towers along the northern frontier served as a physical boundary, an attempt to isolate the imperial core from the nomadic mobility of the Xiongnu Confederation. These early fortifications were built using local materials, comprising compressed layers of gravel, reeds, and desert scrub that resisted the wear of the wind far better than stone. Within these isolated outposts, small garrisons of conscripted soldiers spent their seasons monitoring the horizons for dust plumes that might signal an approaching party of riders. The life of these frontier watchmen was defined by isolation and the rigid routine of administrative reporting. Documents recovered from the dry silt of these ancient watchtowers reveal the mundane reality of military life on the edge of the empire. Soldiers wore simple garments of coarse hemp, their sandals woven from tough plant fibers that wore down quickly against the gravelly soil of the desert tracts. To pay for provisions and maintain local markets, the imperial treasury distributed bronze coins of a specific weight, stamped with administrative characters that verified their value across imperial territory. These small metal discs, carried in linen pouches, represented the farthest reach of the bureaucratic state, linking a soldier in a mud brick tower to the distant mints of the capital. Yet, the purchasing power of these coins remained limited in a borderland where true wealth was measured in livestock, grain, and the physical security of water sources. With the accession of Emperor Wu, a fundamental shift in this defensive posture occurred, transforming the regional geopolitics of East Asia. The young ruler grew increasingly dissatisfied with the traditional policy of buying peace through costly gifts of silk, grain, and imperial princesses to the Xiongnu chieftains. He understood that these seasonal subsidies failed to guarantee permanent stability, serving instead to enrich a rival power that could resume hostilities whenever local conditions changed. Imperial policy subsequently shifted toward offensive engagement, a decision that required a massive mobilization of state resources and a thorough reassessment of military logistics. To strike deep into the northern grasslands or the western desert wastes, the Han military required a different kind of cavalry force, capable of covering vast distances without collapsing from exhaustion. Emperor Wu personally inspected the first specimens of foreign horses when they arrived at the courtyards of the imperial palace in Chang'an, evaluating their physical structure against traditional domestic cavalry stock. These Western horses, obtained from the far kingdom of Dayuan in the Fergana Valley, possessed a stature and bone density that differed markedly from the short, stocky ponies native to the eastern steppes. Rumors circulated among the advisors that these beasts sweated blood, a phenomenon likely caused by skin parasites, but interpreted by the court as a sign of celestial favor and supernatural endurance. The emperor observed the width of their chests, the length of their stride, and the strength of their quarters, realizing that such mounts could carry heavily armored riders across the arid interiors of Asia with unprecedented speed. It is notable how easily an imperial state can mistake an immediate defensive requirement for a grand opportunity for permanent expansion. The acquisition of these horses, initially sought to solve a tactical problem along the northern frontier, inadvertently drew the Han dynasty into a complex web of Western alliances and rivalries. What began as an effort to secure the agricultural borders of China transformed into a systematic project to control the pathways through which these animals were obtained. The imperial mind began to see the western regions not as an empty void of sand and mountain, but as a terrain populated by settled kingdoms whose wealth and resources could be integrated into the strategic orbit of the court. To secure the steady flow of horses and intelligence, the imperial administration authorized the expansion of the frontier defense network farther west into the desert. This initiative led to the formal establishment of the Hexi Corridor as a heavily fortified transit lane, protected by 4 newly organized commanderies. The land was divided into administrative units, and tens of thousands of internal migrants were relocated from the crowded provinces of central China to cultivate the fertile soil of the desert oasis. These military agricultural colonies provided the logistical foundation for all subsequent westward movements, growing the grain and breeding the draft animals necessary to sustain long-distance caravans. At the westernmost terminus of this fortified line stood the outpost of Yumen-Guan, the Jade Gate, a square fortress built of rammed earth that served as the final checkpoint before travelers entered the trackless wastes of the interior. Beyond its walls, the authority of imperial law became thin, relying entirely on the small networks of oasis garrisons that dotted the desert rims. The gate received its name from the valuable nephrite jade that entered China from the mountains of Khotan, carried by early merchants who had navigated the desert paths long before the state took notice. For a traveler leaving the empire, the sight of the Jade Gate fading into the morning haze marked the transition from a highly regulated administrative society to a world where survival depended on water management, local guides, and the endurance of pack animals. Skirting the northern and southern edges of the Taklamakan Desert, the geography west of the Jade Gate splits into two distinct paths that occupy the space between giant mountain ranges. The northern route followed the base of the Tian Shan Mountains, utilizing the seasonal meltwater streams to move from one small oasis to the next, while the southern route clung to the northern slopes of the Kunlun Range. Both pathways presented immense physical hazards, including shifting sand dunes, extreme temperature fluctuations, and the constant risk of losing the faint tracks left by previous caravans. Despite these dangers, the necessity of maintaining contact with the West forced the Han state to maintain a presence along both routes, establishing small courier stations wherever a permanent water source permitted. The caravans that ventured along these early desert tracks were modest operations compared to the massive commercial expeditions of later centuries. They consisted primarily of diplomatic envoys, state-sponsored trade missions, and independent merchants who traveled under the protection of official passports. The cargo they carried was carefully selected for high value and low weight, ensuring that the cost of transport did not exceed the potential profit or strategic utility of the goods. Silk, produced in the imperial workshops of the interior, served as the primary currency of these expeditions, valued by foreign kingdoms for its texture, durability, and rarity. In return, the caravans brought back jade, specialized metals, and information regarding the geography and political structures of distant lands. While the Han state worked to secure these paths, the Xiongnu Confederation remained a constant threat along the northern flank of the corridor. The nomadic horsemen possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain, allowing them to launch sudden raids on the oasis colonies before receding back into the safety of the open steppe. This ongoing conflict meant that early commerce was never entirely peaceful or predictable. It was a militarized economic activity that required constant state intervention to survive. The survival of a caravan often depended on the efficiency of the beacon tower network, which could transmit warnings of enemy movements across hundreds of miles in a single evening using smoke by day and fire by night. Inside the administrative centers of the frontier commanderies, clerks maintained precise records of every horse, cart, and bale of goods passing through the checkpoints. These registers, written on narrow strips of wood or bamboo bound together with hemp cord, provide a meticulous accounting of the grain distributed to foreign envoys and the taxes levied on incoming merchants. The level of detail in these documents indicates that the early Silk Road was not a lawless frontier, but an extension of the bureaucratic machine that governed the Chinese interior. The state monitored the movement of people with the same rigor it applied to the distribution of resources, recognizing that unregulated mobility could destabilize the delicate balance of the borderlands. Translators, artisans, and low-level officials passed continuously through these administrative gates, each carrying specialized knowledge of Western languages and customs. These early intermediaries played a crucial role in translating the commands of the imperial court into the dialects spoken in the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin. Their work allowed for the creation of a shared diplomatic language that facilitated negotiations over trade quotas and military alliances. Over time, these linguistic and administrative connections began to soften the stark division between the agricultural world of China and the pastoral world of Central Asia, creating a space where hybrid cultures could gradually develop. The steady accumulation of these geographical and administrative foundations laid the groundwork for more ambitious diplomatic undertakings. As the Han dynasty consolidated its hold on the Hexi corridor, the need for a comprehensive understanding of the deep interior became paramount. The court realized that isolated garrisons and seasonal patrols were insufficient to secure permanent Western alliances against the Xiongnu. To unlock the full potential of these Western routes, it would be necessary to dispatch an official envoy who could penetrate the unknown territories lying far beyond the furthest watchtower, an enterprise that would test the limits of human endurance and bureaucratic patience. This imperative turned the eyes of the court toward those rare individuals willing to step into the vast, unmapped expanses of the Western horizon. Chapter 2: The Tracks of the Lost Envoy. Zhang Qian, an official of the imperial court, stepped into the Western landscape carrying little more than a bronze insignia of rank and a command to seek out distant allies. Chosen for his physical resilience and administrative reliability, he left the capital city of Chang'an with a retinue of 100 men and a single nomadic guide named Ganfu. Their primary objective was to bypass the hostile frontier forces and locate the Yuezhi, a pastoral people who had been driven westward by the expansion of northern nomadic confederations. The mission required moving through unmapped territories where the lines between political authority and open warfare remained constantly blurred. Moving beyond the outermost agricultural settlements, the small expedition quickly discovered the extreme challenges of navigating a landscape without permanent landmarks. Within weeks of crossing the border, the party was intercepted by a mobile scouting unit of the Xiongnu Confederation, effectively halting their diplomatic progress before it had truly begun. Instead of facing immediate execution, the envoys were stripped of their long-distance transport animals and distributed among different regional camps as state laborers. This sudden detention turned a highly planned diplomatic mission into an indefinite period of forced residency within the vast, undulating pastures of the northern steppe. Throughout his extended detention, which lasted for over a decade, Zhang Qian carefully preserved his bronze imperial tally, keeping the metal disc hidden within his meager personal effects as a sign of his original mandate. The lacquer on the official shaft peeled away under the dry northern wind, and the silk cords frayed into gray threads, yet he held the object as a quiet anchor to his identity as an imperial representative. He lived among his captors, took a local wife, and observed the seasonal migrations of the herds, all while quietly cataloging the geography, resources, and military vulnerabilities of the territory. The small piece of stamped bronze remained a physical link to a home that grew more distant with each passing season. The seasonal camps of the steppe lords carried a distinctive heavy odor of fermented mare's milk, which lingered over the leather tents and the packed earth of the assembly grounds. This beverage served as a primary source of nutrition and hospitality, in an economy that produced no grain or cultivated vegetables. Zhang Qian learned to navigate the social hierarchies of these mobile communities, where influence was maintained through the distribution of horses and the allocation of seasonal grazing rights. He noted the precise construction of their recurved bows and the tactical fluidity of their riders, gathering information that would eventually prove invaluable to the strategic planners in Chang'an. When the internal vigilance of the nomadic guards gradually softened after years of apparent compliance, the envoy and his remaining companions seized a chance to continue their interrupted journey westward. Traveling under the cover of early spring sandstorms, they bypassed the outer watchposts and descended into the dry basin of the Tarim River. The path took them along the southern fringes of the desert, where they relied on the survival skills of Ganfu to locate hidden water holes beneath the dry gravel beds. Each day was a calculated struggle against exhaustion, the small party moving from one isolated oasis to the next until the high peaks of the western mountains rose to meet them. The Fergana Valley opened before the travelers as an expanse of cultivated fields, irrigated orchards, and permanent mud brick settlements that contrasted sharply with the open pastures of the northern steppe. Known to the Han records as the Kingdom of Dayuan, this region supported a dense population that practiced sophisticated agricultural techniques and lived in walled urban centers. The local authorities welcomed the foreign travelers with an interest born of commercial curiosity, providing them with food, clothing, and fresh pack animals to replace those lost during the arduous desert crossing. Zhang Qian observed that these people were peaceful but commercially astute, maintaining active market connections with regions that lay even further to the west. Among the artifacts circulating within the markets of Dayuan were silver coins bearing the distinctive profile and stamp marks of Hellenistic rulers, a material legacy of the old Eastern campaigns of Alexander the Great. These coins, with their precise portraits and Greek inscriptions, demonstrated a level of weight standardization and metallic purity that facilitated long-distance trade across Western Asia. The presence of these objects indicated that the valley was not an isolated pocket of civilization, but a crucial junction where Mediterranean design conventions met the trade networks of the inner continent. The local merchant families stored these pieces in heavy iron-bound chests, utilizing them to purchase horses, fine textiles, and iron tools from neighboring valleys. It remains an enduring truth of historical development that discovery often occurs as an unintended consequence of diplomatic frustration. Zhang Qian eventually located the Yuezhi people in the rich pastures of Transoxiana, but he found that their new prosperity had erased any desire to return east or participate in a dangerous military alliance against the Xiongnu. The primary diplomatic objective of the mission had completely failed, yet the wealth of geographical and economic data gathered along the way transformed the project into an informational success. The envoy recognized that while a military alliance was impossible, the established trade routes through these western valleys offered a different, more sustainable method for extending imperial influence. Deeper into the interior, the expedition passed through the ancient region of Bactria, where the markets displayed an unexpected variety of foreign commodities. Zhang Qian noted with astonishment that merchants were selling bamboo staves and woven cloth produced in the southwestern provinces of China, goods that had traveled through India via independent mountain paths. This realization revealed that long-distance trade networks operated completely outside the knowledge or control of the imperial administration, driven entirely by the shared interests of regional merchant syndicates. The existence of these parallel routes suggested that the Eurasian continent was already linked by an informal web of commercial exchange that lacked only a stable political framework to expand. Further to the west, the political landscape was dominated by the rising power of the Parthian Empire, governed during this period by King Mithridates II. This vast state, which straddled the Iranian plateau and controlled the Mesopotamian trade centers, maintained a highly organized administrative structure capable of regulating international commerce. Mithridates II recognized the potential value of cultivating diplomatic ties with a large Eastern empire, seeing an opportunity to counter the pressure of nomadic incursions on his own northern borders. The arrival of Han emissaries provided the Parthian court with a direct line of communication to an economic power that could supply large quantities of silk. This encounter established a formal diplomatic channel between the two imperial administrations, characterized by an exchange of official gifts and the standardization of caravan protection protocols. Parthian officials provided military escorts for the eastern envoys, ensuring their safe passage through the turbulent borderlands of the western plateau. In return, the Han court dispatched seasonal missions laden with silk, ironwork, and lacquered vessels, materials that quickly became highly prized symbols of prestige among the Parthian elite. The regular movement of these official delegations created a sense of security along the main transit lanes, encouraging private merchant houses to invest more capital into long-distance expeditions. The return journey of Zhang Qian to the imperial capital proved nearly as protracted as his initial outward trek, including a second, briefer period of captivity among frontier raiders. He managed to escape once more during a phase of internal succession turmoil within the nomadic confederation, finally slipping through the Jade Gate with only his wife, his guide Ganfu, and his bronze tally remaining from the original 100-man expedition. Their arrival in Chang'an was treated by the court as a return from the dead, an event that drew large crowds of officials eager to hear reports of the Western world. The physical toll of the journey was evident in the etched lines of the envoy's face and his slow, measured gait. Upon his audience before Emperor Wu, Zhang Qian presented a detailed, systematic report that mapped the political geography, demographic scale, and economic output of the Western kingdoms. He described cities of brick and plaster, vast fields of alfalfa designed to sustain superior horse breeds, and markets where wealth was calculated in strange silver currencies. This comprehensive intelligence shattered the traditional isolationist perspective of the court, replacing a vague mythology of the Western wilderness with concrete data regarding settled, prosperous societies. The emperor realized that the world beyond the frontier was populated not just by nomadic adversaries, but by potential trading partners who valued Chinese products. The imperial administration immediately acted upon this new intelligence, issuing an official decree that opened the western regions to systematic state-sponsored commerce and migration. Resources were redirected from internal infrastructure projects to expand the road network, establish additional courier stations, and subsidize private merchant caravans willing to make the western crossing. The state guaranteed the security of these routes by extending patrols and implementing strict passport controls, ensuring that only registered traders could access the desert tracks. This institutional support transformed the informal paths used by early jade traders into an official commercial network backed by the full administrative weight of the Han dynasty. As the tracks of the lost envoy hardened into permanent caravan routes, the volume of traffic passing through the frontier checkpoints increased with each passing season. The initial excitement of discovery gradually gave way to the complex daily realities of maintaining long-distance logistical networks across hundreds of miles of hyper-arid terrain. To protect these investments from the persistent threat of regional raiding and environmental degradation, the imperial court realized that mobile patrols were no longer sufficient. The stability of this burgeoning commercial network would ultimately depend on the creation of permanent military installations capable of enforcing law and managing resource distribution deep within the dry basin of the Tarim River. Chapter 3: The Garrisons of the Tarim Basin. The administrative framework of the Western Region's Protectorate emerged as a deliberate mechanism to institutionalize imperial control along the remote desert fringes. This permanent bureaucracy sought to stabilize what had previously been a volatile zone of intermittent military expeditions. By placing appointed officials in permanent residences within the oasis towns, the Han court aimed to establish a predictable presence that could mediate local conflicts without immediate recourse to the capital. The strategy required a fundamental transition from mobile defense to fixed territorial oversight, anchoring the authority of the state in the physical reality of the frontier soil. Constructing these permanent installations demanded a standardized approach to architecture that could withstand the specific challenges of the desert environment. Mud and silt gathered from seasonal riverbeds formed the primary material for the walls, mixed with chopped straw to prevent cracking under the intense heat. Scribes recorded that the baked clay bricks used for the outer bastions measured exactly 16 inches in length and 8 inches in width, a uniform dimension that allowed builders to calculate material requirements across vast distances. These square fortresses, positioned at intervals of one day's march, provided a secure refuge for traveling officials and storage space for emergency grain reserves. Within the cool, thick-walled interiors of these administrative offices, long rows of clerks managed the daily logistics of frontier governance. Administrative markings on split bamboo slats served as the primary medium for these records, each narrow strip of wood containing a single column of ink characters detailing grain allocations or passport verifications. Bound together with hemp cord, these documents formed bulky registers that accumulated in wooden chests, tracking the subtle movements of wealth and people through the checkpoints. The steady scratching of wooden brushes against bamboo strips filled the quiet rooms, creating a meticulous, paperless trail of imperial oversight. During the reign of Emperor Ming of Han, this institutional network received renewed attention as the court sought to reassert its influence after a period of internal domestic disruption. The revival of the Western policy required an experienced hand who understood both the diplomatic nuances of the oasis states and the military realities of the desert terrain. The choice fell upon a former court scribe whose analytical acumen and administrative discipline made him uniquely suited for long-distance diplomacy. His assignment was to restore the authority of the protectorate and ensure that the trade routes remained open to state traffic. General Ban Chao assumed command of the Western territories with a small contingent of clerks and officers, relying on diplomatic leverage rather than massive military force. He understood that the diverse oasis principalities of the Tarim Basin were caught between the competing pressures of the northern nomads and the expanding power of southern kingdoms. His strategy focused on building regional coalitions, offering imperial protection in exchange for exclusive trade agreements and administrative compliance. This delicate balance of power required constant adjustment, as local rulers often shifted their allegiances based on immediate security concerns. A critical test of this diplomatic strategy occurred when the general arrived at the western oasis of Kashgar, a vital junction where the northern and southern desert tracts converged at the foot of the Pamir Mountains. The local leadership found itself deeply divided, torn between the traditional authority of regional rivals and the potential benefits of alignment with the Eastern Empire. Ban Chao entered the settlement without an army, accompanied only by his personal staff and a small guard, intending to demonstrate imperial confidence through his unhurried presence. He requested a formal audience with the ruling council, preparing to articulate a vision of mutual security that would redefine the region's alignment. Sitting before the oasis leadership in a central meeting hall, the general outlined the structural advantages of a permanent alliance with the Han court, emphasizing the predictable legal protections that would follow. He refrained from making overt military threats, choosing instead to explain how stabilized trade routes would enrich the local merchant families while securing the valley against external raiding parties. His argument was supported by the distribution of official seals and fine textiles, material tokens that confirmed the status of the local rulers within the imperial hierarchy. The council listened in silence, considering the balance of risk before ultimately agreeing to dissolve their ties with northern factions and accept the administrative oversight of the protectorate. It is a fundamental reality of international commerce that trade routes require legal predictability far more than they require romantic enterprise or heroic adventures. While individual courage was necessary to navigate the physical dangers of the terrain, the long-term vitality of the Silk Road depended on the dry certainties of contract enforcement and stable court systems. A merchant setting out from a distant valley needed to know that his property would be protected by recognizable laws and that disputes would be adjudicated without violence. The establishment of stable military courts within the garrisons provided this essential security, laying the legal foundation for complex credit arrangements among disparate groups. To sustain these distant garrisons without bankrupting the central treasury, the imperial administration implemented the Tunchian system of military agricultural colonies. Soldiers stationed along the desert margins spent a significant portion of their deployment clearing land, digging irrigation ditches, and planting drought-resistant crops. These self-sufficient farming communities produced large quantities of wheat, millet, and alfalfa, ensuring that the outposts could feed themselves even if supply lines from the interior were disrupted by weather or war. The agricultural transformation altered the landscape around the forts, turning patches of gravelly desert into green islands of cultivation. Water management formed the critical core of this agricultural effort, requiring sophisticated engineering techniques adapted to hyper-arid conditions. Engineers developed systems of underground channels that captured the snowmelt from distant mountain ranges before it could evaporate in the dry desert air. These subterranean conduits, maintained by specialized maintenance crews, delivered a steady stream of fresh water directly to the fields and garrison cisterns. The distribution of this vital resource was tightly regulated by administrative officials who utilized clay timers to ensure that each plot of land received its precise allocation of moisture. Along the sand wastes of the Taklamakan, the garrisons also developed a systematic method for tracking the passage of caravans across the northern and southern paths. Every expedition was required to check in at specified outposts, where officials verified the identity of the travelers, inspected the cargo, and stamped their travel documents. This rigorous tracking system allowed the Protectorate to monitor the volume of trade and respond quickly if a caravan failed to arrive at its destination within the estimated time frame. The paths became structured corridors, supervised by an administrative apparatus that valued order above all else. Gradually, these isolated military watchtowers transformed into lively administrative hubs that attracted a diverse population of regional merchants, translators, and artisans. Settlements grew up around the mud walls of the forts, featuring temporary market stalls where local produce could be exchanged for luxury goods from distant provinces. The presence of a permanent garrison provided a safe space for travelers to rest their animals, repair equipment, and exchange information regarding route conditions ahead. These frontier settlements became the true melting pots of Central Asia, where distinct cultural traditions lived in close proximity. The presence of stable military courts also facilitated the growth of sophisticated credit networks that allowed merchants to operate without carrying massive quantities of physical coinage. Legal contracts, written on wooden tablets and witnessed by garrison officials, guaranteed that debts incurred in one oasis could be settled in another settlement hundreds of miles away. This administrative security reduced the risk of robbery along the tracks, as high-value transactions could be executed through paperwork rather than the physical transfer of precious metals. The development of these financial instruments demonstrated the deep trust that merchants placed in the institutional permanence of the Protectorate. Further complications arose as the expanding power of the Kushan Empire in the south began to influence the political balance of the western Tarim Basin. This sophisticated state, which united parts of northern India and Afghanistan, maintained its own commercial interests and sought to extend its influence over the wealthy oasis cities. Ban Chao handled these interactions with characteristic caution, utilizing defensive alliances and diplomatic delays to avoid a direct military confrontation that could disrupt the trade lanes. His ability to maintain imperial authority without provoking an all-out regional war preserved the commercial infrastructure for decades. Managing the distant outposts required balancing local autonomy with imperial oversight, a delicate task that tested the patience of successive administrations. The court understood that imposing rigid central laws on diverse populations with their own ancient traditions would likely provoke local insurrections. Local rulers were therefore permitted to retain their internal administrative systems and traditional customs, provided they acknowledged the supreme authority of the protectorate and paid their annual tributes. This flexible approach minimized friction between the garrison forces and the indigenous communities, ensuring a degree of stability that benefited both parties. Under the long administration of the Western Region's Protectorate, the overland routes achieved a level of security that allowed for unprecedented cultural and material fluidity. For nearly a century, the systematic coordination of garrison patrols, agricultural colonies, and legal courts kept the desert pathways clear of major disruptions. The constant movement of goods through these fortified corridors altered the consumption habits of elites across the continent, creating an enduring demand for foreign products that survived even when the political power of the Han Dynasty eventually began to recede from the western frontier. This institutional architecture provided the stable matrix through which rare commodities could travel without constant risk of confiscation or loss. While the state focused heavily on the regulation of people and livestock, the materials themselves began to exert an independent influence on the economies of distant empires. Among these commodities, none held a greater fascination for Western societies than the fine, lustrous textiles that moved silently through the northern and southern checkpoints. The growing demand for this material in distant Western capitals would soon create a powerful incentive for foreign courts to look past the complex logistics of trade and focus on the biological mystery of its production. Chapter 4: The Silken Secret of the West. Cultivated silk, derived from the cocoons of a delicate moth, possessed properties that no other textile of antiquity could replicate. Its long, continuous protein fibers reflected light in a manner that produced a characteristic soft luster, while its natural tensile strength allowed it to be woven into remarkably thin, durable sheets. In the ancient world, this fabric was more than a luxury item. It served as a form of currency, a diplomatic tool, and a universal symbol of high social standing. Because the methods for producing this material were kept strictly confidential within its land of origin, foreign societies remained completely dependent on long-distance trade networks to acquire even small quantities of the precious thread. For generations, the Chinese imperial authorities guarded the secrets of sericulture with absolute severity. The laws of the empire designated the unauthorized export of silkworms, their eggs, or the seeds of the white mulberry tree as a capital offense, punishable by execution. Frontier checkpoints were instructed to search the baggage of every departing traveler, paying close attention to anyone suspected of carrying hidden biological materials. This strict state-enforced technology embargo ensured that while finished textiles flowed outward along the caravan tracks, the means of production remained concentrated within domestic workshops, maintaining a highly profitable global monopoly. Roman elites consumed these imported fabrics with an intensity that caused significant anxiety among conservative state administrators in the West. The smooth, shimmering material became a fixture of imperial dress in Rome and later in Constantinople, worn by senators, court officials, and wealthy matrons who paid exorbitant prices for garments dyed in deep purple tones. Because the trade required a continuous outflow of precious metals to satisfy Eastern suppliers, Western treasuries experienced a persistent drain of gold and silver coins. This economic imbalance alarmed civic planners, who watched the physical wealth of the state steadily dissolve into luxury goods that offered no practical military or administrative utility. Intermediary empires, particularly the Sasanian rulers of Persia, derived immense fiscal advantage from their strategic position between the eastern workshops and the western markets. They controlled the key transit points through which every caravan had to pass, imposing heavy tariffs and arbitrary regulations that inflated the final cost of silk. By managing the supply lines, the Persian administration could manipulate Western markets at will, occasionally withholding cargo during periods of political tension to pressure the Byzantine state. This geopolitical friction forced Western leadership to recognize that economic security required breaking the traditional monopolies and establishing an independent source of supply. Within the grand administrative chambers of Constantinople, Emperor Justinian first faced a mounting fiscal crisis driven by these commercial vulnerabilities. The ongoing conflicts with the Persian state had disrupted the traditional overland routes, causing the price of raw silk to rise to unprecedented levels. This inflation threatened the stability of the domestic weaving industry, which employed thousands of artisans in the coastal cities of the Levant and Greece. Justinian understood that conventional military expeditions were insufficient to solve a structural economic problem, turning his attention instead toward unconventional methods of securing the coveted material. Empress Theodora participated actively in these court discussions, recognizing that the prestige of the imperial household was closely linked to its economic autonomy. She maintained her own network of informants and diplomats throughout the East, seeking any intelligence that might reveal a weakness in the Sasanian trade network. Through her patronage, the court explored alternative maritime routes around the Persian Gulf, attempting to establish direct contact with Western Indian ports where silk was occasionally transshipped. When these maritime initiatives yielded limited results due to the sheer distance involved, the imperial couple grew receptive to more daring strategies. A solution emerged from an unexpected quarter when two Nestorian monks arrived at the imperial palace after a long residence in the Far East. These religious travelers had spent years within communities that sat along the active trading corridors of Central Asia, where they had quietly observed the daily operations of sericulture. They informed the emperor that they could obtain the living organisms necessary to establish a local silk industry, provided the court would guarantee their safety and fund their return journey. The proposition represented an extraordinary intelligence opportunity, shifting the state's strategy from trade diplomacy to active industrial espionage. Carrying wooden staves that appeared to be nothing more than the standard equipment of traveling pilgrims, these men devised a method for smuggling the essential biological components of the trade out of Eastern territory. The staves were hollowed out, creating a long, narrow internal cavity capable of concealing thousands of tiny, fragile silkworm eggs. This simple concealment allowed the monks to pass through the strict frontier checkpoints without arousing the suspicion of border guards, who routinely inspected packs and baskets but ignored the walking sticks of religious ascetics. The success of the entire enterprise rested on the contents of these two hollow segments of bamboo. Months of patient walking followed as the monks retraced their steps across the high plateaus and desert tracts of Central Asia, moving slowly to protect their hidden cargo. They traveled in the company of ordinary caravans, resting at the same oasis stations, and navigating the same mountain passes that carried the standard commercial traffic of the era. The continuous vibration of the journey and the constant changes in altitude presented a constant threat to the survival of the organisms within the staves. The travelers had to remain hyper-vigilant, ensuring that their walking sticks were never exposed to direct moisture or sudden impacts that could crush the delicate eggs inside. Success depended entirely on maintaining an optimal temperature variation within the hollow containers, keeping the delicate silkworm eggs from hatching prematurely during the transit. If the interior of the staves grew too warm, the larvae would emerge without a ready food supply and perish within hours in the dark enclosure. The monks managed this risk by regulating their travel schedule, moving primarily during the cooler hours of the early morning and sheltering the staves in the deepest, coolest corners of mud brick caravanserai during the heat of the day. This delicate thermal management preserved the dormancy of the organisms across thousands of miles of arid terrain. This episode illustrates the inherent vulnerability of state monopolies when confronted with persistent international market demand. No matter how severe the legal penalties or how rigorous the frontier inspections, the continuous economic incentive to acquire a valuable technology will eventually find a path through the tightest security networks. The Han and subsequent dynasties had maintained their secret for centuries through geographical isolation and administrative discipline, yet the entire system was compromised by two individuals carrying common items of travel. The physical scale of an empire can be undermined by the movement of biological material no larger than a grain of sand. Upon the safe arrival of the monks in Constantinople, the imperial administration immediately established secure workshops under direct palace supervision to nurture the surviving eggs. The larvae emerged into a carefully controlled environment where attendants provided constant care, monitoring the humidity and cleanliness of the rearing trays to prevent disease. This initial stock served as the foundation for a state-controlled breeding program that gradually expanded across the imperial provinces. The monopoly had been permanently broken, and the Byzantine state began the slow process of building its own independent textile industry. Cultivating the necessary food supply for the newborn larvae required the widespread planting of white mulberry trees across the Byzantine provinces, particularly in the Peloponnese and the valleys of Syria. The cultivation of these trees transformed local agricultural landscapes, as fields previously reserved for grain or olives were converted into specialized orchards. Imperial edicts regulated the harvesting of the leaves, ensuring that the young worms received a steady supply of fresh nutrition during their intensive feeding cycles. This agricultural shift required years of patience, as the trees needed to reach a specific maturity before their foliage could sustain large-scale sericulture operations. The unique texture of these Mediterranean-grown leaves, though subtly different from the foliage of the Chinese river valleys, proved sufficient to sustain the nascent western silkworm colonies. The insects adapted to their new environment, spinning cocoons that yielded filaments of high quality, which imperial weavers transformed into garments that rivaled the imported products. The court established direct control over the distribution of this domestic thread, ensuring that the profits from the new industry remained within the state treasury. This domestic production significantly reduced the empire's dependence on Persian intermediaries, altering the balance of economic power in the region. Gradually, the economic architecture of the Western Levant and Greece adjusted to the presence of this local luxury industry, while imported silks from the Far East continued to command a premium for their superior dye techniques and complex weave patterns. The availability of domestic Byzantine silk stabilized the regional market. The massive drain of precious metals from west to east began to slow, allowing the administration in Constantinople to retain its gold reserves for military defense and administrative reform. The silken secret had become an integrated component of Mediterranean commerce, establishing a legacy of production that would endure for centuries. While the monopoly had been breached at its western terminus, the physical networks through which other luxury goods moved remained heavily dependent on the specialized merchants of Central Asia, whose desert mansions still commanded the great transit routes. These commercial houses continued to manage the flow of spices, glass, and metals that could not be replicated by Western technology, ensuring that the overland pathways retained their vital importance. The breaking of the silk secret did not diminish the utility of the trade lanes. Instead, it highlighted the adaptability of the communities that occupied the space between the great empires of the world. Chapter 5: The Mansions of the Sogdian Merchants. North of the Oxus River, where the dry steppes soften into the fertile alluvial valleys of Transoxiana, the landscape invited a different rhythm of human settlement. Here, the Zarafshan and Kashkadarya rivers descended from the high eastern mountains, creating wide bands of arable land before disappearing into the western sands. This unique geography, situated precisely between the nomadic pasture lands of the north and the agrarian empires of the south, made the region an inevitable corridor for long-distance transit. Travelers moving across Eurasia found in these valleys a predictable sanctuary, rich in water, forage, and urban amenities. In these well-watered enclaves, the Sogdian people established a dense network of fortified agricultural and commercial hubs that formed the true hub of overland trade. Rather than forming a centralized empire governed by a single monarch, they organized themselves into a loose confederation of autonomous city-states, each ruled by a local prince who derived his revenue from commercial taxation and land leasing. This decentralized structure allowed individual cities to adapt flexibly to changing geopolitical conditions, maintaining neutrality when larger powers collided. The shared identity of these communities rested not on military allegiance, but on a common language, a sophisticated legal tradition, and a universal commitment to international trade. The physical growth of Samarkand and Panjikent during this period reflected the massive accumulation of wealth flowing through the Transoxianan corridor. Surrounding agricultural lands were systematically cleared, irrigated, and planted with orchards, vineyard fields, and grain crops to sustain an expanding urban population. Massive walls constructed from thick layers of packed earth protected the administrative cores of these cities, enclosing marketplaces, palaces, and industrial quarters where metalworkers and weavers operated. Outside the main defensive perimeters, sprawling suburbs developed, filled with warehouses, caravanserais, and the permanent residences of foreign merchant groups. Within the grand, multi-storied mansions of the native mercantile elite, the interior spaces reflected an artistic sophistication that drew elements from multiple civilizations. Excavations have revealed spacious reception halls covered in elaborate, colorful frescoes depicting diplomatic processions, hunting expeditions, and narrative scenes from epic literature. These paintings show figures dressed in rich, patterned silk tunics, adorned with heavy gold jewelry and bearing specialized glassware imported from the Mediterranean coast. The architectural scale of these residences demonstrated that the true aristocracy of Transoxiana was defined by commercial success rather than ancient lineage or military conquest. One afternoon during the early decades of the 4th century, a Sogdian merchant named Nane Vandak sat in a frontier office near the Hexi corridor and compiled a series of urgent letters to his business partners in Samarkand. He dipped his reed pen into black ink, writing on sheets of local paper in the fluid, cursive script of his homeland, detailing the severe political disruptions that had paralyzed the markets of central China. His correspondence reported the sack of the imperial capital, the flight of the court, and the consequent collapse of the credit networks that had funded their recent seasonal expeditions. He advised his associates to halt further investment until stable governance could be restored, expressing a cautious hope that their existing inventory might retain its value. These documents never reached their intended destination in the western valleys, becoming stranded instead inside the dry masonry of an isolated watchtower near Dunhuang, following a sudden local border closure. The courier carrying the linen pouch was apparently forced to abandon his route, leaving the texts to be buried beneath drifting sand and accumulated dust for over 15 centuries. When modern archaeologists recovered the bundle, the fragile paper remained remarkably intact, preserving the precise financial anxieties and personal greetings of a man whose world had been upended by distant political collapse. The letters offered a vivid window into a sophisticated network of family firms that manage commercial operations across thousands of miles of wilderness. The abandonment of these letters highlights a persistent condition of ancient commerce, the absolute reliance on slow, patient communication across immense distances. A merchant operating in a frontier outpost might wait 2 entire seasons to receive an answer to a query regarding current commodity prices or the solvency of a distant partner. This long delay forced a deliberate, patient posture onto ancient mercantile societies, requiring local agents to possess significant decision-making autonomy and an unhurried confidence in their established legal frameworks. Wealth was built not through rapid, instantaneous transactions, but through the gradual accumulation of trust over months of silence. Written on fragments of raw sheepskin, multilingual receipts provide evidence of the daily administrative discipline that sustained these trading houses. In a single ledger entry, notations in the native Sogdian script appeared alongside characters drawn from Brahmi, Kharosti, and Middle Persian, recording the transfer of silver ingots, draft camels, and sacks of unrefined musk. These leather fragments served as legally binding contracts, verified by the distinct seal impressions of local judges and the signatures of international witnesses. The preservation of these technical documents shows that the movement of luxury goods was always underpinned by a meticulous, multicultural legal apparatus. Inside the deep cellars of the Panjakant warehouses, large storage jars covered in distinctive green and blue lead glazes lined the floors, containing a diverse array of commodities gathered from across the continent. These ceramic vessels protected fragile items from moisture, dust, and pests, ensuring that valuable shipments of saffron, indigo dye, and refined medicinal resins survived the multi-month journey across desert depressions. Scribes monitored the intake of these jars, checking the wax seals that guaranteed the purity and origin of the contents against official cargo manifests. The cellars remained cool and quiet, holding the material residue of global demand within their heavy clay walls. It is remarkable how a specialized minority community managed to coordinate international logistics across unstable political borders without the backing of a massive imperial military force. While the Han Dynasty, the Sasanians, and the nomadic confederations possessed the raw power to destroy cities, the Sogdians possessed the linguistic skills, cultural flexibility, and administrative expertise required to make those empires mutually intelligible. They served as the indispensable bureaucrats, translators, and financial advisors to the very rulers who claimed sovereignty over the trade lanes. Their influence was maintained through diplomacy and utility rather than coercion, demonstrating that knowledge could occasionally outmaneuver brute force. Along these same commercial lanes, the teachings of the prophet Mani found a highly receptive audience among the literate Sogdian diaspora. This religious tradition, which emphasized a cosmic struggle between light and darkness, utilized the established merchant networks to distribute its beautifully illustrated manuscript books across Central Asia. Sogdian translators rendered the complex theological texts into their native dialect, adapting technical terms from older regional religions to make the new doctrines accessible to local readers. The merchant houses funded the transcription of these texts, seeing the preservation of sacred literature as an act of piety that also reinforced their community's literacy. Religious texts translated into the local vernacular traveled northward into the camps of nomadic chieftains and eastward toward the internal provinces of China, demonstrating how spiritual ideas rode the currents of commercial traffic. Monasteries and shrines developed alongside the caravanserais, creating a shared sacred geography that offered travelers both spiritual comfort and physical protection. The interaction between different faiths within the marketplace produced a unique intellectual environment, characterized by the peaceful coexistence of Buddhist, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Manichaean communities. The roads functioned as intellectual conductors, carrying philosophical systems as efficiently as they carried tangible goods. This spiritual and commercial network remained remarkably resilient even when surrounding nomadic empires threatened the physical security of the routes. When the Hephthalites and later the Western Gokturks asserted their dominance over the Transoxianan valleys, they quickly recognized that destroying the Sogdian infrastructure would eliminate their own access to international wealth and diplomacy. Rather than suppressing the merchant houses, the steppe khans chose to partner with them, employing Sogdian diplomats to negotiate trade treaties with the Byzantine court and the rulers of China. This alignment of nomadic military power and sedentary commercial expertise created a powerful symbiosis that expanded the reach of the routes. Preserved by the dry desert air, the soft parchment and fragile paper fragments survived the centuries, preserved long after the stone fortresses of their contemporary rulers had crumbled into dust. This ironic durability of fragile materials reveals that the records of human cooperation often outlast the monuments of military conquest. While the grand defensive walls designed to separate empires eventually eroded into featureless mounds of silt, the private letters, receipts, and prayers written on scrap paper persisted beneath the sand. The small traces of daily accounting outlived the grand statements of imperial ambition. The wealth accumulated by these transoxianan trading houses gradually transformed the political leverage of the region, turning it from a borderland dependency into a critical pivot point for continental history. The local elites utilized their resources to fortify their estates, refine their agricultural techniques, and patronize a sophisticated urban culture that would influence neighboring regions for generations. As the major empires on either side of the continent experienced internal transformations and shifts in focus, the valleys between the rivers remained steady keepers of the overland tradition. This continuity prepared the region to receive and reshape the new cultural currents that were beginning to gather force along the eastern horizons. Chapter 6: The Journey of the Monastic Scholar. Xuanzang, a young scholar monk residing in the capital city of Chang'an during the early years of the Tang dynasty, grew increasingly perplexed by the deep contradictions he encountered within the existing Chinese translations of sacred texts. The available manuscripts, hand-copied over generations and translated by various foreign intermediaries, left many philosophical questions unresolved, creating divisions among the local monastic communities. He concluded that the only method for restoring clarity to his tradition was to travel directly to the ancient intellectual centers of northern India to acquire the original Sanskrit versions. This ambition required a long-term commitment to a journey of immense physical and political uncertainty across the unmapped interior of Asia. The administrative priorities of the newly established Tang court under Emperor Taizong complicated this individual plan, as the state had recently issued a strict decree prohibiting foreign travel across the northwestern border. Following a period of civil conflict and nomadic pressure, the government sought to stabilize its frontier populations by limiting unregulated movement and closing the gates to unauthorized departures. Despite being denied an official passport, the scholar resolved to depart in secret, relying on the assistance of sympathetic monks and local merchants who operated along the fringes of the law. His departure occurred during the quiet hours of autumn, his figure blending easily into the ordinary movement of the frontier caravans. Arriving at the westernmost margins of the fortified corridor, the traveler faced the imposing reality of the desert watch stations that guarded the approaches to the deep interior. Xuanzang tracked his path across the gravel wastes by observing the bleached skeletons of pack animals near the border installations of the Jade Gate, using these stark white markers as an informal guide through the shifting sand dunes. The sight of these remains served as a constant reminder of the physical cost of long-distance transit, marking the locations where previous expeditions had succumbed to exhaustion or thirst. He moved between these grim signposts with a deliberate, unhurried step, his attention focused on preserving his meager provisions. Across the trackless expanses lying beyond the imperial walls, the absence of official protection forced the pilgrim to depend entirely on the hospitality of isolated desert communities and local guides. These guides possessed an intimate, unwritten knowledge of the desert hydrology, understanding how to locate small pockets of moisture hidden beneath the dry clay crust of the lake beds. The journey through these hyper-arid zones proceeded primarily during the night to minimize water loss. The travelers navigating by the alignment of the stars and the shape of the dunes. Survival remained a daily calculation, as the misplacement of a single landmark could result in the total depletion of their water skins before the next oasis could be reached. Heavy wool capes, weighing upwards of 15 pounds when dry, provided the primary defense against the extreme temperature drops that characterized the desert nights. These garments, woven from the dense fleece of northern sheep, shielded the traveler from the biting winds that descended from the high eastern mountain ranges, while also serving as bedding during the brief periods of rest. In the daytime, the capes were folded and strapped to the pack frames, their coarse fibers retaining the dust and salt of the flats. The physical weight of this clothing added significantly to the burden of the crossing, requiring a steady expenditure of energy from both humans and transport animals. The oasis kingdoms along the northern rim of the desert, particularly the state of Gaochang, welcomed the arriving scholar with an interest that went far beyond mere commercial courtesy. The local king, a devout adherent of the foreign faith, recognized the intellectual prestige that an eminent scholar from the Tang capital could bring to his provincial court. He attempted to detain Xuanzang permanently, offering him a position as chief religious advisor and providing him with rich material resources to establish a permanent school. Refusing these honors, the scholar embarked on a hunger strike to demonstrate his absolute commitment to his original destination, an action that eventually persuaded the ruler to grant him safe passage and extensive travel provisions. Because local rulers recognized the political utility of maintaining secure communications with neighboring states, they furnished the pilgrim with official letters of introduction addressed to the Western nomadic Hans. These documents, written on smooth parchment and sealed with regional insignias, transformed the unauthorized traveler into an honored guest within the mobile encampments of the Western Gokturks. The Khans, who controlled the vital pastures of the upper valleys, granted him military escorts that protected his party from the independent raiders occupying the mountain passes. This administrative coordination allowed the expedition to move through volatile borderlands that were normally inaccessible to private caravans. It remains a notable pattern in continental history that roads established primarily for commercial profit frequently become the main pathways for intellectual and spiritual transformation. The infrastructure built by merchants to transport silk, metals, and spices provided the exact network of stations, legal protections, and guides needed by wandering scholars and monastics. While the state viewed the routes through the lens of tax revenue and border defense, the continuous movement of people allowed philosophical systems to travel with the same efficiency as physical commodities. The tracks in the sand, worn smooth by the hooves of pack horses, served as an intellectual conductor linking separated intellectual worlds. During the transition into the higher alpine zones of the Tian Shan Range, the character of the journey shifted from a struggle against aridity to a confrontation with extreme cold and precipitous terrain. The expedition climbed through narrow, icy gorges where a single misstep meant falling into deep mountain crevasses that never surrendered their contents. High-altitude sickness affected both the men and the pack animals, causing severe disorientation and exhaustion that slowed their daily progress to a few miles. Xuanzang recorded that several members of his party perished during these mountain crossings, their bodies left beneath the eternal snows of the ridges. A specialized timber framework, designed to be carried on the back of a dedicated traveler, served as the primary method for transporting the fragile manuscript scrolls collected along the way. This manuscript carrier featured a series of lightweight wooden shelves protected by oilcloth curtains that shielded the ink from moisture and dust, while a small canopy overhead provided shade during the midday hours. The dimensions of these carriers were precisely calibrated to distribute the weight evenly across the shoulders of the bearer, allowing him to maintain balance on narrow mountain trails. Within these portable libraries, the intellectual heritage of distant monasteries rested securely, moving slowly across the continental divide. The fertile plains of northern India eventually welcomed the traveling scholar after months of arduous high-altitude transit, presenting a landscape of grand monasteries, diverse languages, and ancient philosophical schools. He directed his steps toward the great monastic university of Nalanda, a massive center of learning that housed thousands of scholars and held the largest collection of Buddhist literature in the world. The authorities of the university received the Eastern traveler with deep respect, assigning him senior quarters and providing him with access to rare manuscripts that had never been seen in the East. He spent several seasons within these brick courtyards, mastering Sanskrit and studying the complex logical systems of the local schools. For more than a decade, the scholar immersed himself in the intensive routine of textual transcription, working closely with local pandits to verify the accuracy of every line. He copied thousands of verses onto dried palm leaves, utilizing a specialized ink that resisted the damp heat of the river valleys, and organized the materials into structured bundles secured by silk cords. His growing reputation for dialectical skill attracted the attention of powerful regional monarchs, including King Harsha of Kannauj, who ruled a vast North Indian empire. The king invited Xuanzang to participate in grand public assemblies, where the Eastern scholar successfully defended his interpretations against rival schools, earning high honors and further manuscript gifts from the court. The decision to retrace his steps eastward arose from a realization that his gathered materials were now sufficient to correct the structural errors that had troubled the Eastern monastic communities. Unlike his secret, midnight departure years before, his return journey was conducted with the full diplomatic support of the regional Indian courts, which provided a large caravan and an official military escort to guarantee the safety of his collections. He carried over 600 distinct texts, packed into secure timber crates and laden onto several elephants and pack horses that moved in a steady procession. This valuable cargo represented years of focused collection, comprising the largest intellectual transfer of its kind in ancient history. In the narrow gorges of the Pamir Mountains, the returning caravan encountered severe environmental obstacles that threatened to undo the labor of the previous decade. A sudden flash flood during a river crossing caused the loss of several pack animals, including one of the elephants carrying a portion of the Sanskrit manuscripts and rare botanical specimens. The scholar spent days working with local mountain guides to salvage what could be recovered from the silt, drying the damp palm leaves on flat rocks under the mountain sun. Despite these losses, the core of the collection survived the crossing, entering the familiar desert tracks of the Tarim Basin as autumn began to chill the air. Xuanzang reached the administrative boundaries of the Hexi corridor in the 16th year of his journey, halting his caravan at a frontier outpost to dispatch an official letter to the imperial palace. He understood that his original departure had violated state law, and he chose to remain at the border until he received explicit confirmation that his return would be permitted by the court. His message detailed the geographic information he had gathered, the alliances he had observed, and the vast collection of literature he was bringing back to enrich the empire. This strategic presentation of intelligence was designed to satisfy the pragmatic administrative priorities of the Tang state, framing his spiritual quest as an informational asset for the realm. Emperor Taizong recognized the immense utility of the scholar's geographical data, granting a full imperial pardon and arranging a magnificent public reception for his entry into Chang'an. The broad avenues of the capital were lined with thousands of citizens and officials who watched the procession of horses and crates move toward the imperial palace. The ruler granted the scholar an extended private audience, questioning him minutely regarding the climates, populations, and political structures of the western regions and the Indian kingdoms. This interaction marked a permanent change in the state's attitude toward the West, shifting from a defensive policy of containment to an active engagement with the cultures of the deep interior. A dedicated translation bureau emerged under direct imperial patronage at the newly constructed Great Wild Goose Pagoda, creating a structured workplace where scholars could convert the Sanskrit texts into classical Chinese characters. Xuanzang supervised this bureaucratic operation for the remainder of his life, coordinating the work of master translators, scribes, and proofreaders who maintained a rigorous schedule of production. The precision of their methodology ensured that the translated texts retained the logical nuances of the originals, establishing a standardized vocabulary that transformed the philosophical landscape of East Asia. The pagoda became a monument to a long-distance intellectual transfer, its heavy brick walls sheltering thousands of newly written scrolls. The detailed records left behind by the monastic scholar, compiled in his monumental text on the Western regions, provided subsequent Tang administrators with a definitive guide for their expanding foreign policy. His descriptions of river locations, pass conditions, and regional agricultural outputs allowed imperial strategists to plan military movements and diplomatic missions with unprecedented accuracy. These written accounts converted an unfamiliar landscape into a structured space that could be monitored, taxed, and integrated into the broader imperial system. The steady integration of this geographical knowledge positioned the state to confront the complex institutional frictions that were beginning to gather force along its westernmost rivers. Chapter 7: The Current of the Talus River. The institutional expansion of the Yangtze Protectorate during the middle decades of the 8th century represented the furthest administrative reach of the Tang dynasty into Central Asia. This military governorship, operating from its headquarters at Kucha, managed a complex system of subordinate garrisons, postal stations, and agricultural colonies designed to supervise the local principalities of the Western Basin. By utilizing an elaborate framework of honorary titles, court ranks, and material subsidies, The Eastern administration integrated the rulers of these oasis states into its own bureaucratic hierarchy. The primary function of this system was to secure the transit corridors against northern raiding parties while maintaining a predictable environment for revenue collection and trade registration. Simultaneously, from the west, the administrative apparatus of the expanding Abbasid Caliphate was moving steadily into the fertile valleys of Transoxiana, carrying a different religious and political framework. Following the overthrow of the previous dynasty, the new rulers in Baghdad sought to consolidate their authority over the lucrative commercial hubs of Samarkand and Bukhara, which had long operated as autonomous merchant republics. This expansionist movement depended on establishing direct taxation networks and forming strategic agreements with local elites who desired protection against external nomadic groups. The rapid growth of this Western administrative sphere introduced a competing center of gravity that directly challenged the traditional influence of the Eastern Empire in the region. Where these two expanding administrative frontiers converged, regional rivalries among local rulers quickly escalated into a significant geopolitical confrontation between the major powers. A specific territorial dispute between the principalities of Fergana and Tashkent provided the immediate catalyst, as both factions appealed to their respective imperial patrons for direct military intervention. The Eastern governor viewed the insubordination of Tashkent as a direct threat to the prestige of his court, leading to a punitive expedition that resulted in the execution of the local ruler and the confiscation of his state property. This severe action provoked a strong reaction among the neighboring western valleys, prompting them to formally request the assistance of the nearby Abbasid garrison forces. General Gao Shenzur, commanding the garrison forces of the Anshi Protectorate, recognized the growing risk of isolation and resolved to lead a long-distance expedition over the mountains to confront the Western forces directly. His army, consisting of approximately 20,000 regular imperial soldiers, supplemented by a large contingent of Karluk mercenary horsemen, embarked on a grueling march through the high-altitude passes of the western Tian Shan Range. The logistics of the movement required transporting large quantities of iron armor, specialized crossbow equipment, and grain reserves across precipitous paths where pack animals frequently slipped into deep ravines. Despite these immense environmental difficulties, the expedition descended into the upper valley of the Chu River with its structural cohesion intact, intending to settle the regional balance of power through a decisive engagement. Reaching the wide plains of the Talus River in the midsummer of 751, the Eastern expedition encountered the combined forces of the Abbasid Caliphate and their regional Central Asian allies. The two armies positioned themselves along the banks of the waterway, initiating a series of cautious, low-energy skirmishes that lasted for 5 consecutive days without producing a clear advantage for either side. The dense, disciplined formations of the Eastern infantry utilized their heavy shields and long spears to resist the initial cavalry movements of the Western forces, maintaining their position despite the intense heat of the valley. This prolonged standoff tested the endurance of the soldiers and the resourcefulness of their commanders, who spent the evenings adjusting their lines and monitoring the surrounding hills for signs of local reinforcements. During the 5th day of the standoff, the structural cohesion of the Eastern Coalition fractured unexpectedly from within, when the Karluk mercenary units decided to shift their allegiance. These nomadic horsemen, positioned on the flanks of Gao Xianji's army, launched a sudden coordinated movement against the rear lines of the imperial infantry, while the Abbasid forces pressed forward from the front. This simultaneous pressure from two directions broke the defensive integrity of the eastern formations, turning a well-organized line into a fragmented mass of isolated units attempting to secure their own paths of retreat. The general was forced to abandon his position, escaping through the narrow mountain passes with only a fraction of his original regular force remaining under his immediate command. Following the collapse of the front lines, the remaining imperial soldiers faced either immediate capture or extended retreats through unfamiliar territory, effectively ending the eastern states' ambition for direct territorial expansion west of the Pamir Mountains. The outcome of the battle established a permanent geopolitical boundary between the two empires, limiting the westward reach of Chinese administrative law and securing the Islamic character of the Transoxianan valleys for subsequent centuries. Yet the anticipated collapse of regional trade failed to materialize. Instead, the stabilization of this political frontier created a predictable framework that allowed private merchant houses to resume their operations with minimal long-term disruption. It is a notable irony of continental development that military encounters resulting in strategic defeat often serve as the primary catalyst for the transmission of foundational civilian technologies. While the political planners in Chang'an viewed the Talus River campaign as a costly logistical failure, the physical displacement of populations caused by the battle initiated an intellectual transformation that altered the administrative capabilities of the Western world. Among the thousands of prisoners captured by the victorious Abbasid forces were numerous skilled artisans, scholars, and specialized workers who carried the technical traditions of their homelands into the workshops of the West. This human movement broke old technological monopolies far more effectively than generations of peaceful commercial exchange. Among the prisoners escorted along the road to Samarkand were several master craftsmen from the imperial paper workshops, individuals who understood the precise manufacturing processes required to produce smooth, durable writing surfaces from common organic waste. These artisans were settled within the urban quarters of the city, where the local authorities provided them with the resources necessary to construct permanent workshops along the banks of the regional waterways. In these newly established mills, the craftsmen demonstrated the refinement of pulp mixtures to administrative scribes, utilizing the steady current of the river to power the heavy mallets needed to macerate fibrous materials. This practical demonstration marked the formal entry of papermaking technology into the Mediterranean and Islamic spheres of influence. The technical execution of this craft required an intimate knowledge of material properties, as workers had to select, wash, and boil raw materials until they formed a uniform fibrous slurry. Scribes noted the distinct difference between the starchy texture of hemp waste pulp utilized in these early Central Asian workshops and the traditional mulberry bark paper sheets produced within the internal provinces of China. The wet pulp was carefully captured on fine mesh screens, shaken to interlock the fibers, and then transferred to flat surfaces where the weight of heavy wooden pressing frames squeezed out the remaining moisture. These uniform frames required continuous maintenance to prevent warping, their heavy timber handles operated by teams of laborers who monitored the drying cycle with practiced care. Under the immediate patronage of the local Abbasid governor, the first permanent paper mills outside of East Asia grew rapidly, turning Samarkand into the primary production center for writing materials in the Western world. The availability of clean river water and abundant local crops of flax and hemp allowed the industry to expand without relying on imported raw materials from distant regions. Regional merchants quickly recognized the immense commercial value of the new product, purchasing large quantities of the light, durable sheets to sell to administrative offices and religious scholars throughout the caliphate. The local mills established a standard of quality that remained unmatched in the West for generations, their product known widely in distant markets as Samarkand paper. This material shift gradually altered the bureaucratic practices of the Western administration, replacing the traditional reliance on expensive parchment and fragile papyrus with a material that was both economical and difficult to alter. Paper sheets possessed an absorbent surface that drank the ink deeply, making fraudulent erasures or unauthorized modifications instantly visible to tax collectors and legal judges. This structural security allowed for the creation of more complex financial instruments, including long-distance bills of exchange, detailed maritime manifests, and permanent customs registers that could be bound into thick, durable ledgers. The efficiency of the state bureaucracy increased in direct proportion to the availability of the new medium. As the technology spread from Transoxiana toward the Mediterranean coast, new paper mills emerged in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, fueling an unprecedented expansion of intellectual and literary culture across the continent. The lower cost of production allowed libraries, religious academies, and scientific institutions to multiply, creating a vast market for hand-copied books that preserved and expanded the knowledge of antiquity. Scholars from diverse backgrounds utilized the uniform sheets to record mathematical calculations, geographical descriptions, and translations of philosophical works, creating a shared intellectual vocabulary that linked separated societies. The material infrastructure of knowledge had become globalized, driven by a technology that had crossed the frontier in the baggage of captive artisans. The stabilization of this western boundary left the interior valleys of Central Asia to develop their own complex synthesis of cultural and commercial practices, operating under the nominal oversight of Western governors, but maintaining their essential role as logistics specialists for overland trade. The physical roads, though occasionally touched by the movements of regional armies, remained steady conduits for the migration of goods, ideas, and techniques across the continental shelf. Over the subsequent centuries, these pathways would experience a long phase of political fragmentation as smaller regional dynasties rose and fell along the desert rims, each attempting to manage the flow of wealth through their individual checkpoints. This localized pattern of control persisted until a massive unifying force began to gather along the northern grasslands, preparing to bring the entire network of roads under a single absolute authority. Chapter 8: The Standard of the Steppe Unification. Across the vast northern grasslands that stretch from the Khingan Mountains to the Altai Range, the climate dictated a life of constant mobility, where human communities moved in harmony with the seasonal cycles of water and pasturage. This open steppe environment, Though separated from the wealthy agricultural valleys of the south by rugged mountains and deep deserts, retained a latent capacity to influence the geopolitics of the entire continent. For centuries, the fragmentation of the nomadic tribes had prevented the emergence of a unified northern power, leaving the transcontinental trade routes to navigate a shifting patchwork of regional authorities and local exactions. Prior to the 13th century, a caravan attempting to cross Eurasia had to negotiate separate protection fees, transit tariffs, and physical inspections with dozens of independent principalities and tribal configurations. These arbitrary regulatory hurdles increased the total cost of long-distance transport, forcing merchants to operate primarily within narrow regional circuits rather than attempting the full continental crossing. The lack of a centralized legal authority meant that contracts made in one jurisdiction held little validity in the next, exposing commercial investments to constant political risks. Genghis Khan altered this fragmented landscape systematically by consolidating the disparate nomadic clans under a single administrative framework and a unified military command. Through a series of protracted internal campaigns, he dismantled the traditional tribal hierarchies, replacing them with a decimal military organization that prioritized state allegiance over ancient lineage. This political consolidation transformed the northern grasslands from a source of chronic instability into a highly disciplined administrative core capable of projecting power across immense distances. As a direct result of this internal unification, the newly organized nomadic state turned its focus outward, incorporating the major commercial centers of Central Asia into its expanding administrative sphere. The traditional oasis networks of the Tarim Basin, the wealthy merchant cities of Transoxiana, and the trade hubs of Persia were systematically brought under the authority of the Supreme Court. While the initial campaigns resulted in significant physical destruction to urban centers that resisted submission, the subsequent implementation of imperial law provided a level of continental stability that had not existed since the height of antiquity. It remains a striking paradox of historical development that the disruption and destruction of ancient urban centers can occasionally clear the path for the implementation of advanced international communication systems. By sweeping away the localized tariffs and regional border barriers that had choked Eurasian transit for centuries, the unification of the steppe created an unprecedented space for continental integration. The state prioritized the security of the transit lanes, understanding that the unhindered movement of intelligence, resources, and luxury goods was essential for the maintenance of a transcontinental empire. This state priority materialized in the formal establishment of the Yam postal system, a continuous network of courier stations and posts that linked the capital centers of the east with the furthest frontiers of the west. Positioned at intervals of approximately 25 to 30 miles, corresponding to the distance a healthy horse could cover at a sustained gallop before reaching exhaustion, these stations provided fresh mounts, secure lodgings, and provisions for official envoys. The maintenance of these posts was mandated as a permanent tax obligation upon the surrounding local populations, ensuring that each station remained fully stocked with forage and animals throughout the seasons. Late one autumn evening, a lone imperial courier arrived at a remote post station situated on the edge of the semi-arid grasslands, his body leaning forward to balance the weight of his travel-worn frame. He unbuckled a heavy leather belt to display a circular silver passport stamped with the official seal of the Supreme Court, presenting the token to the station master to verify his immediate authorization for an animal exchange. Within minutes, a fresh mount was led from the stables, its breath clouding in the chill air as attendants quickly transferred the courier's sealed saddlebags to the new leather rigging. Without speaking a word, the rider mounted the fresh beast and disappeared back into the darkness of the open track, his arrival and departure recorded silently by a clerk on a small paper ledger sheet. The design of the specialized leather saddlebags used by these rapid couriers reflected a meticulous attention to the physical requirements of long-distance communication under extreme conditions. Constructed from heavy, oil-treated horsehide that resisted both moisture and dust, these bags featured interior compartments wrapped in layers of felt to protect official correspondence from the continuous vibration of the ride. The closures were secured by intricate iron clasps and sealed with state wax impressions, ensuring that the contents remained unread until they reached their final administrative destination. These bags were designed to fit snugly against the flanks of the mount, minimizing friction and allowing the horse to maintain its maximum velocity across varied terrain. To regulate access to this rapid transit network and prevent unauthorized utilization of state resources, the administration implemented a strict passport system based on metallic tablets known as paisa. These rectangular or circular plates, worn visibly on the belts of official envoys and accredited international merchants, served as an absolute command for local officials to provide assistance, food, and fresh transport animals on demand. The laws of the empire prescribed severe penalties, including execution, for any station master who delayed a bearer of an official tablet or failed to maintain the required number of healthy horses in his stables. The metallic composition and alloy ratios of these administrative passports varied precisely according to the rank and authority of the bearer, providing an instant visual cue to the officials managing the stations. Senior princes and supreme military commanders carried tablets cast from refined gold or silver-gilded bronze, often adorned with the carved image of a falcon or a tiger, to signify their high status within the imperial hierarchy. Lower-level administrative clerks and ordinary diplomatic messengers utilized tablets composed of unadorned iron or cast bronze, stamped with simpler inscriptions that limited their access to specific geographical routes or a fixed number of animal exchanges. These small metal plates functioned as a universal currency of state authority, recognized by border guards and station masters across thousands of miles of diverse territory. Under the subsequent reign of Ogedei Khan, the structural organization of this courier system, known natively as the Urtoe, achieved its highest degree of administrative standardization and continental efficiency. He authorized a systematic survey of all major Eurasian trade routes, registering every station, calculating distance intervals with precision, and establishing fixed funding quotas from the central treasury to support the infrastructure. This reform transformed the informal paths used during the initial military campaigns into a permanent, institutionalized network of communication that functioned continuously regardless of seasonal weather shifts. Traversing the immense geographic span from the coast of China across the Altai Mountains, through the old cities of the Oxus Valley, and down onto the Iranian plateau, This system created a continuous chain of contact that unified distinct climatic zones. A letter dispatched from the imperial offices of the East could reach the shores of the Black Sea in a fraction of the time required by traditional merchant caravans, allowing the central administration to monitor regional market fluctuations and respond to political developments with unprecedented speed. The vastness of Asia had been rendered manageable by a system that valued velocity and administrative compliance above all else. The immediate consequence of this unprecedented continental integration was a significant lowering of commercial risks and insurance costs for international trading houses operating across Eurasia. Private merchant syndicates, particularly those organized into cooperative investment partnerships known as the Ortog, could deploy large capitals with a reasonable expectation that their investments would survive the long journey across the interior. The state actively protected these merchant groups, recognizing that their commercial activities generated vital tax revenue and provided the court with essential luxury goods and strategic intelligence. To encourage international commerce further, the imperial administration implemented targeted tax exemptions and legal protections for foreign traders who registered their operations with the local governors. Merchants were granted access to the secure precincts of the post stations during periods of local unrest, and the state legal code provided mechanisms for recovering losses incurred through robbery or administrative negligence along the official routes. This favorable legal environment attracted a diverse array of merchants, translators, and financial agents from Europe, the Levant, and India, all seeking to participate in the lucrative markets of the unified continent. The resulting period of relative stability, known historically as the Pax Mongolica, allowed for a volume of cross-continental traffic that altered the consumption habits and material cultures of civilizations separated by thousands of miles. Silk, porcelain, jade, and lacquer moved westward in steady, predictable streams, while Western silver, specialized glassware, and technical knowledge flowed eastward to enrich the imperial centers of the interior. The boundaries between regional trade networks dissolved, giving rise to a singular, integrated system of global commerce that depended entirely on the continued maintenance of the steppe infrastructure. As these commercial currents deepened and stabilized over decades of continuous administrative supervision, the center of economic gravity began to settle within the grand capital cities constructed by the later rulers of the unified empire. The old frontier outposts and seasonal encampments were gradually eclipsed by massive urban centers that combined nomadic administrative traditions with the settled wealth of old agricultural civilizations. The pathways through the interior were now secure, and the narrative moved naturally toward those grand accounting houses where the wealth of the entire continent was systematically recorded, managed, and redistributed under the watchful eyes of the imperial scribes. Chapter 9: The Accounting Houses of Cambaluc. Marco Polo, a young merchant from the maritime Republic of Venice, arrived at the winter capital of Cambaluc after a 3-year terrestrial journey that had tested the limits of his family's commercial endurance. He entered the grand metropolitan complex not as an invading conqueror, but as an observant clerk, his mind trained to evaluate regional economies through the precise metrics of weight, purity, and exchange value. His background in Western accounting techniques allowed him to appreciate the intricate administrative machinery that sustained the court of Kublai Khan, a system that managed the resources of millions of sedentary subjects from a single centralized seat of power. The young Venetian spent his initial months learning the language and scribal customs of the court, preparing himself to serve within the imperial bureaucracy as an independent inspector. The urban landscape of Cambaluc presented an extraordinary manifestation of geometric planning, its wide avenues arranged in a precise grid system that contrasted sharply with the labyrinthine organic growth of contemporary European ports. This massive capital, constructed under the direction of multi-ethnic engineers, integrated traditional architecture with the grand scale required for a continental administrative center. Within its outer ramparts, expansive storage yards held thousands of bushels of grain, harvested from the southern provinces and transported northward via the newly extended Grand Canal network. The continuous arrival of these food supplies ensured the economic stability of the court, insulating the urban population from the seasonal agricultural shortages that frequently plagued less integrated states. Inside the grand accounting houses of the capital, the imperial administration executed its fiscal policies through a specialized bureaucracy that operated entirely separate from the traditional military elite. Teams of trained scribes, sitting at long timber tables beneath the shade of silk awnings, recorded the intake of regional tributes, customs dues, and market taxes on uniform sheets of mulberry paper. These financial records were organized into meticulous ledgers, each entry verified by the distinct stamp marks of provincial governors and the signatures of accounting officers who check the math twice before filing. The quiet rustle of paper and the soft clink of counting tokens filled the workspace, creating a steady rhythm of administrative industry that persisted from dawn until dusk. One humid afternoon during the height of the trading season, the young Venetian observed the verification of block-printed paper currency by imperial accounting officers within a highly secured courtyard of the treasury. He watched as senior clerks examined large stacks of the dark mulberry sheets, checking the alignment of the woodblock impressions against official master plates to detect any signs of counterfeit production. Each bill, measuring approximately the size of a standard ledger page, bore an intricate inscription warning that unauthorized replication would result in immediate decapitation, a legal threat backed by the full administrative weight of the state. The senior officer applied a heavy vermilion ink seal to the center of each verified note, confirming its absolute validity before releasing the currency back into the hands of waiting merchant representatives. The specific seal configurations used on these official financial instruments featured complex geometric patterns and archaic characters that were exceptionally difficult for ordinary woodcarvers to replicate with precision. Carved from blocks of fine jade or cast in solid bronze, these state seals remained under the constant guard of imperial officers, who stored them in iron-bound boxes wrapped in heavy silk cloths when the accounting houses closed for the night. The application of the wet red ink provided a clear visual guarantee of value, transforming a simple piece of tree bark into a legally binding medium of exchange that had to be accepted throughout the empire. For an observer accustomed to the heavy gold and silver coinage of the Mediterranean, this paper-based system represented an astonishing conceptual leap that decoupled wealth from the physical mass of precious metals. It is a common tendency among foreign observers to focus intently on the fiscal innovations and apparent wealth of an empire, while overlooking the deep structural vulnerabilities that lie beneath its polished administrative surface. Marco Polo recorded the efficiency of the paper currency system with a high degree of professional admiration, marveling at how easily the court could manufacture wealth through the simple application of ink to paper. He failed to note, however, that this entire economic apparatus depended entirely on absolute public trust in the permanence of the dynasty and the continuous enforcement of strict price controls along the market lanes. When subsequent internal conflicts and administrative overspending eventually eroded this trust, the paper currency would experience a rapid devaluation, transforming the once valuable sheets into worthless scraps of stained wood pulp. Across the southwestern trade corridors, where the overland routes descended into the humid valleys of Yunnan and Burma, the fiscal administration adjusted its practices to accommodate regional traditions that predated the arrival of the Northern Empire. In these distant borderlands, the local population maintained a long-standing preference for cowrie shells and small segments of unrefined salt as their primary mediums of exchange, resisting the introduction of the central paper notes. The imperial court managed this resistance with a characteristically pragmatic flexibility, allowing local collectors to accept these alternative currencies for tax payments, provided their value could be calculated against the standard silver ingots held in the central treasury. This adaptive monetary policy preserved regional economic fluidity, ensuring that luxury goods continued to move toward the capital without provoking local insurrections. Among the valuable commodities processed by the accounting houses of Cambaluc were large shipments of indigo spice blocks, imported from the Malabar coast through the expanding maritime transshipment hubs of the south. These dense blocks of dark blue dye, measuring precisely 6 inches square and wrapped in dried palm leaves to prevent moisture degradation, were highly prized by the textile workshops of the capital for their deep, permanent coloration. Scribes recorded the arrival of each crate, calculating the customs tariffs based on the total weight and checking the quality of the pigment by dissolving small chips in clean water to evaluate its purity. The presence of these subtropical dyes within the northern markets demonstrated the extraordinary reach of the trade networks, which could connect the coastal industries of southern India with the elite consumers of the northern court. Kublai Khan reinforced this continental economic integration by maintaining continuous diplomatic and commercial communications with his relatives who governed the Ilkhanate state on the Iranian plateau. This sibling branch of the imperial family managed the western sectors of the trade network, supervising the ancient market centers of Tabriz, Baghdad, and Shiraz under a similar system of administrative oversight. The two courts exchanged specialized administrative personnel, financial advisors, and geographical charts on a regular schedule, ensuring that their fiscal policies remained mutually intelligible and supportive. This high-level coordination allowed for the smooth transfer of large capitals across the continent, as a merchant firm could secure a line of credit in Cambaluc and draw upon those funds months later in an accounting house near the Persian Gulf. The overland transit corridors connecting these two imperial centers traverse some of the most challenging topography of the inner continent, yet they remained active throughout the seasons due to the systematic maintenance of the infrastructure. Caravans left the western gates of the capital in steady successions, their movements coordinated by state-appointed guides who understood the precise locations of the seasonal waterholes and the grazing capacities of the intermediate valleys. These long-distance expeditions carried large inventories of fine silks, lacquered vessels, and carved jade ornaments, materials that commanded high prices in the Western markets where such craftsmanship could not be replicated locally. The path was long and unhurried, the animals moving at a walking pace that allowed them to conserve their strength for the high mountain passes that lay ahead. This vast accumulation of wealth and administrative efficiency created an illusion of permanent stability that seemed to defy the traditional cycles of imperial rise and fall. Yet, beneath the orderly surface of the accounting ledgers, the financial demands of continuous military campaigns and grand architectural projects began to place an unsustainable burden on the state's resource base. The court attempted to solve these mounting fiscal imbalances by increasing the volume of paper currency in circulation, a decision that slowly undermined the stability of the entire monetary system. Inflation began to surface within the urban markets, causing the prices of basic foodstuffs and clothing materials to rise gradually, despite the strict administrative penalties imposed on uncooperative merchants. The clerks in the accounting houses spent more time adjusting their exchange ratios and recording the depreciation of the paper notes, their brushes moving with a subtle, unvoiced anxiety as they tracked the mounting deficits. Private merchant syndicates, recognizing the long-term risks associated with the inflating paper currency, began to quietly shift their wealth back into tangible commodities that retained their intrinsic value regardless of state decrees. They accumulated stocks of silver ingots, fine gemstones, and high-quality textiles, storing these materials in secure suburban warehouses rather than converting them into official treasury notes. This defensive economic behavior reduced the liquidity of the urban markets, forcing the administration to issue increasingly severe edicts to compel the surrender of precious metals to the state banks. The interaction between the state and the marketplace grew increasingly tense, characterized by a silent struggle between administrative coercion and mercantile preservation. The changing economic environment eventually prompted foreign advisors and long-distance travelers to consider their own paths of departure before the structural stability of the court deteriorated further. Marco Polo, having served the imperial administration for nearly 2 decades as an itinerant official, requested permission to return to his native Venice, a request that was initially denied by the aging Khan, who valued his observational skills. A diplomatic opportunity finally emerged when the court needed to escort an imperial princess to her wedding with an Ilkhanate ruler in Persia, an enterprise that required an experienced navigator familiar with the maritime and terrestrial routes of the south. The Venetian family joined this grand maritime expedition, leaving the walls of Cambaluc behind them as they stepped onto the decks of the heavy transport ships that waited at the southern docks. As the ships cleared the harbor and turned their bows toward the southern seas, the overland pathways through the interior continued to operate under the momentum of centuries of established custom, though their long-term vitality was increasingly threatened by regional political fragmentation. The grand accounting houses of Cambaluc remained open, their scribes continuing to record the influx of taxes and the outflow of currency with the same mechanical precision that had characterized their work for generations. However, the unified authority that had once guaranteed the absolute security of a traveler from the borders of Europe to the coasts of China was beginning to experience a slow, irreversible decline. This gradual weakening of the imperial center allowed older, more dangerous regional instabilities to return to the desert tracts, preparing the way for a phase of contraction that would soon redefine the demographic balance of the entire continent. Chapter 10: The Shadow of the Black Death. As a direct consequence of the unprecedented continental integration that characterized the height of the Pax Mongolica, the very pathways that had facilitated the flow of wealth became a highly efficient conduit for the transmission of biological catastrophe. The continuous movement of rapid couriers, merchant caravans, and military detachments across thousands of miles allowed localized pathogens to leap across natural geographical barriers that had previously insulated human populations for generations. Within the crowded caravanserais and post stations of the interior, rodents and parasites found a welcoming environment, traveling silently within the grain sacks, felt blankets, and leather saddlebags of unsuspecting travelers. They moved from the remote marmot populations of the Central Asian steppes into the densely populated agricultural valleys and urban market centers of both the East and the West. During the middle decades of the 14th century, unusual reports of sudden, devastating mortality began to filter out of the deep interior of Asia, causing a subtle undercurrent of anxiety among international trading firms. These accounts described whole communities succumbing to a rapid febrile illness within a few days of the appearance of distinct swellings in the groin and armpits. Traveling with the speed of the imperial mail couriers, the contagion bypassed traditional quarantine barriers, tracing the exact lines of the Yam network across the grassland corridors. No regional administration possessed the medical knowledge or the bureaucratic infrastructure required to contain a biological vector that left no visible traces until its victims were already beyond recovery. Loss of human life on an unprecedented scale quickly translated into a severe systemic paralysis of the agrarian economies that underpinned the trade routes. Across vast agricultural zones, fields that had been systematically cultivated for centuries under imperial supervision were left untended as entire villages were emptied of their labor force within a single season. The sudden reduction in grain harvests and livestock maintenance severely disrupted the supply chains of the trade lanes, making it increasingly difficult for caravans to secure necessary provisions during their long crossings. Without a steady surplus of local food, the cost of maintaining horses and draft animals rose exponentially, forcing many merchant houses to suspend their operations indefinitely. Along the fragile oasis fringes of the Tarim Basin, the demographic crisis struck a fatal blow to the labor-intensive irrigation systems that made desert life possible. Maintaining the underground channels and water gates required a continuous coordination of community labor, an annual investment of physical effort that vanished when the local populations contracted below a critical threshold. Sand dunes began to drift back over the newly abandoned fields, choking the water channels with silt and drying up the ancient cisterns that had sustained travelers since the days of the early Han Dynasty. By disrupting these vital water stations, the crisis caused the permanent abandonment of long-frequented route segments, forcing subsequent travelers to undertake longer, more dangerous detours through the northern hills. It is a fundamental reality that the ultimate vulnerability of any complex commercial network is not the stability of its currency or the strength of its fortifications, but the physical survival of the human populations that maintain its stations. An empire can rebuild a ruined watchtower or reform an inflated paper monetary system, but it cannot easily replace a generational lineage of specialized camel drivers, translators, and guides. When these human links are broken by a demographic shock, the entire geographic framework of trade becomes thin and brittle, losing its capacity to absorb local disruptions. The roads themselves remained visible as physical indentations in the gravelly plains, yet they ceased to function as economic conduits because the communities that animated them had receded into the silence of the earth. The Crimean Peninsula, operating as the primary maritime and terrestrial transshipment hub for northern trade routes, became a critical flashpoint where the contagion entered the Mediterranean economic sphere. Within coastal depots like Kaffa and Tana, wealth had grown through processing the influx of eastern silks and furs brought down via the steppe routes under the protection of Italian mercantile treaties. These fortified factories, managed by Genoese and Venetian agents, maintained close ties with the interior, receiving daily shipments of goods from the northern Khanate. When the regional armies of the steppe contracted the illness during a protracted siege of Kaffa, the physical proximity of the defenders and the besiegers ensured that the disease quickly bypassed the stone battlements. Inside the port city of Kaffa, a Genoese merchant named Niccolò de Maffeo stood on the wooden wharf, watching a thin column of smoke rise from an abandoned watchtower along the northern road. He carried a heavy iron keyring and a bundle of shipping manifests, his hands trembling slightly as he listened to the unusual silence that had settled over the outer mercantile suburbs. Turning toward his family's warehouse, he pulled the thick oak doors closed, sliding a heavy timber bolt into place and melting red wax over the keyhole to seal the structure against potential looters. The building held dozens of bales of unrefined raw silk, boxes of dried rhubarb, and crates of fine porcelain, material wealth that had suddenly lost its utility in a port where the ships were already preparing to flee the gathering mortality. By analyzing the surface of Italian mercantile parchment preserved from this chaotic winter, the changing lease values and sudden cancellations of maritime contracts reveal the scale of the commercial contraction. Scribes recorded sharp declines in the value of warehouse spaces and dockside tenements as families sought to liquidate their overseas investments at any price to fund a retreat to rural estates. Gradually, the neat Latin notations became increasingly irregular, punctuated by brief notices of the deaths of prominent partners and the insolvency of long-established credit houses in Genoa and Venice. These legal records, written with hurried strokes of a goose quill, demonstrate how rapidly the financial architecture of the Mediterranean adjusted to the reality of a paralyzed trade network. Leaving the infected ports of the Crimea behind them, the surviving Italian galleys turned their bows southward toward the Bosporus, carrying the biological vector within their dark, congested holds. The ships moved slowly across the black water, their crews already depleted by the rapid onset of the illness during the voyage. When these vessels arrived at the docks of Constantinople, The local customs officials boarded the decks to inspect the cargo manifests, completely unaware that the air and the textiles within the holds carried a threat that would redefine the capital. Within weeks of their arrival, the urban quarters of the Byzantine capital experienced a massive demographic decline that paralyzed the administration of the state. In an attempt to neutralize the perceived danger, sulfur compounds and dried aromatic resins were burned in large iron braziers at the port check stations, filling the harbor air with a thick yellow smoke intended to clear the perceived atmospheric miasma. Officers believed that the pestilence was carried by foul odors and damp sea air, and they forced arriving crews to remain on their ships until the pungent fumes had completely washed over the woodwork. Because this rudimentary chemical treatment proved ineffective against a biological vector that nested within the fur of fleas and rodents, the disease entered the city walls undisturbed. The heavy, choking smell of sulfur lingered over the stone wharves for months, a material reminder of a society attempting to combat an invisible crisis with ancient medical theories. Ibn Battuta, the celebrated Moroccan traveler who had spent decades navigating the trade lanes of Asia and Africa, arrived in the Levant during the height of the regional outbreak. He recorded with a detached historical gravity how the great cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and Jerusalem were transformed into spaces of collective mourning and administrative paralysis. The daily mortality numbers reached thousands within the urban cores, forcing the local authorities to abandon standard funeral rites and utilize mass graves outside the city gates. Despite the pervasive danger, the traveler continued his journey along the traditional pilgrim and trade routes, utilizing his legal training to observe how different communities maintain their social order amidst the collapse. Because the administrative personnel of the empire were concentrated within the urban centers and post stations, the mortality struck the governing apparatus with disproportionate severity. The highly integrated YAM postal network lost the continuous coordination required to maintain its speed, as many station masters died without being replaced by the central treasury. Without the regular presence of state patrols and secure courier stations, regional banditry returned to the mountain passes and desert depressions, making long-distance travel exceedingly hazardous for private caravans. The legal protections that had guaranteed the security of an international merchant from one end of the continent to the other slowly dissolved, leaving individual expeditions to defend themselves against local warlords. Consequently, the rising costs and immense physical risks associated with overland transport forced European and Western Asian merchant houses to fundamentally reassess their long-term strategies. They began to look with increasing interest toward maritime trade routes that could bypass the unstable land corridors of the interior entirely. Ocean-going vessels required fewer intermediate transit agreements, carried significantly larger cargo volumes, and were independent of the shifting political alliances of the steppe or the desert oasis. By driving investment away from the interior tracks, this commercial reassessment initiated a gradual but permanent realignment of international trade, shifting capital investment away from the interior tracks toward the blue water ports of the south. The interior valleys of Central Asia, which had long functioned as the wealthy intermediaries of global commerce, began to experience a phase of economic insulation and regional isolation. Within cities that had housed grand mansions, multilingual academies, and complex paper workshops, commercial revenues dwindled as the great caravans became infrequent occurrences. The local princes, stripped of their lucrative transit taxes, were forced to reduce their administrative staff and neglect the maintenance of public infrastructure. Instead of disappearing in a single dramatic moment, the great Eurasian trade network contracted into separate regional circuits, its overarching unity fading into the memory of a more connected era. As the mid-14th century drew to a close, the demographic and economic landscape of the Western Termini remained altered by the decades of contraction. The old Byzantine state, weakened by population loss and fiscal depletion, found itself increasingly incapable of maintaining its traditional hegemony over the maritime entry points of Europe. This institutional vacuum drew the attention of new political configurations that were gathering strength on the Anatolian plateau, forces that sought to implement their own administrative structures over the ancient waterways. Steadily, the focus of continental history was shifting toward that critical juncture where the land routes met the sea gates, a space where a new political order would soon rewrite the rules of international transit. Chapter 11: The Changing of the Golden Horn. By shifting the geopolitical weight of the Eastern Mediterranean, the restructuring of territorial control around the Bosporus fundamentally altered the economic patterns of overland Eurasian commerce. The city of Constantinople had long functioned as a grand aquatic sieve, collecting, taxing, and distributing the final overland arrivals of Asian luxury goods into Western European markets. When a new administrative authority established its sovereignty over this vital strait in the mid-15th century, the old commercial treaties that had favored maritime republics like Genoa and Venice were systematically revised. This institutional shift forced long-distance merchant syndicates to reevaluate the financial viability of sending large capitals across the terrestrial interior of Asia. Ottoman administrative priorities turned increasingly toward centralization, standardizing revenue collection, and enforcing strict regulatory oversight at every maritime and land checkpoint. New tariff schedules were drafted by court clerks, increasing the duties levied on foreign transit goods and requiring all non-Muslim merchant firms to register their transactions with state judges. These administrative reforms were designed to enrich the imperial treasury and secure domestic control over the primary trade terminals, yet their practical effect was to increase the frictional costs of transcontinental trade. The predictable legal environment that had once been maintained by the Pax Mongolica was replaced by a localized fiscal landscape that prioritized imperial state revenue over free mercantile transit. Long accustomed to operating with significant autonomy within the old Byzantine quarters, Western European merchant houses found themselves navigating a far more restrictive regulatory framework that squeezed their profit margins. Long-distance caravans carrying silk from Persia or spices from the Indian Ocean were frequently delayed at border gateways while officials verified the purity of currencies and audited cargo manifests. The increased financial risks associated with these administrative delays made overland transport less attractive to the great banking families of Florence and Venice, who began to withhold their investments from the traditional terrestrial routes. Capital began to accumulate in Western ports, waiting for alternative opportunities that offered greater security and lower institutional friction. Sultan Mehmed II oversaw this administrative transition with a systematic attention to bureaucratic detail, converting the old imperial capital into the administrative heart of an expanding Islamic state. His approach to governance emphasized the meticulous documentation of all taxable assets, a policy that contrasted sharply with the final, impoverished decades of the Byzantine administration under Constantine XI. The transition of power, though marked by a historic siege, resulted in a highly ordered reorganization of the city's commercial spaces rather than a prolonged phase of economic chaos. The new ruler understood that the wealth of his realm depended on the continuous productivity of its markets, and he sought to regulate rather than destroy the networks of exchange that met at the Golden Horn. During the humid summer months of 1453, a group of school-trained Ottoman customs clerks sat at low timber desks within the shaded land gates of Galata, systematically updating the official tariff ledgers to reflect the revised state regulations. They dipped their reed pens into black ink, meticulously recording the names, nationalities, and cargo descriptions of arriving Western traders who had traveled down the final segments of the Balkan Highway. Beside them, an imperial supervisor verified each entry against master registers issued by the court in Edirne, ensuring that no unauthorized exemptions were granted to the foreign firms. The steady scratching of pens on thick paper sheets marked the formal implementation of a new economic order, transforming the ancient terminal into a heavily supervised imperial checkpoint. Suspended from a heavy timber beam near the Galata docks, large iron scales operated continuously throughout the day, weighing the silver and gold coins offered by foreign merchants against the standard weights authorized by the Sultan's mint. Clerks observed the balance of the iron beam with practiced accuracy, checking for any signs of coin clipping or debasement before recording the final tax payments in the customs ledgers. The soft clink of Venetian ducats and Ottoman silver akçe hitting the bronze scale pans provided a constant auditory backdrop to the legal transactions that authorized the movement of goods into the city's markets. These iron balances served as the physical manifestation of state authority, enforcing a uniform standard of value at the boundary where the overland trade met the maritime shipping lanes. European mercantile strategies shifted away from territorial dependencies toward maritime exploration as a direct response to these rising costs and unpredictable regional alignments. The realization that a single state could completely control the primary western exit point of Eurasian trade created a powerful incentive to seek alternative pathways that lay entirely outside the jurisdiction of traditional land empires. Merchant syndicates began to fund speculative geographic research, looking for ways to bypass the Mediterranean entirely by utilizing the open ocean. This reallocation of resources marked the beginning of a long-term decline in the volume of capital directed toward the maintenance of the interior caravan infrastructure. It is a compelling observation that the closure or heavy regulation of an ancient road often forces open the geography of the wider world, driving human ingenuity to look past established boundaries. When the overland paths through Central Asia grew too costly due to institutional friction, the energy that had sustained those routes did not vanish. It was redirected toward the Atlantic margins of Europe. The restriction of a traditional commercial channel compelled societies to look toward the sea, transforming an immediate logistical obstacle into the catalyst for a global maritime integration. The old land routes had served their purpose by demonstrating the immense value of transcontinental contact, and their contraction provided the necessary pressure to launch a new era of oceanic discovery. Kingdoms along the Atlantic coast, particularly Portugal and Spain, invested heavily in developing long-distance maritime exploration technologies that could withstand the unique challenges of deep-sea navigation. Shipwrights refined the design of caravel vessels, combining traditional square rigging with latent sails to create ships capable of sailing against the wind along unfamiliar coastlines. These technological advancements allowed mariners to contemplate journeys that bypassed the traditional overland routes entirely, opening up direct maritime paths around the African continent to the wealthy trading centers of India and East Asia. The focus of global wealth began a permanent migration from the interior valleys of Asia to the Atlantic ports of Western Europe. Scribal notations on early Western maritime charts reflected this expanding geographical consciousness, their precise ink lines mapping the contours of newly discovered capes, river mouths, and oceanic wind patterns with an increasing degree of mathematical accuracy. Cartographers drew intricate rhumb lines across the vellum surfaces, providing navigators with reliable bearings that allowed them to maintain their courses across vast stretches of open water without relying on coastal landmarks. These charts, stored in protective leather tubes within the cabins of exploration vessels, represented a different kind of administrative power, one based on the systematic recording of natural maritime geography rather than the fortification of land tracks. The lines on the parchment grew longer with each passing season, tracing the pathways of a new commercial empire. The successful establishment of direct ocean routes to the spice ports of India and the silk markets of China caused a permanent, irreversible decline in the volume of terrestrial caravan traffic across the interior of Asia. Shipping goods by sea proved drastically cheaper than maintaining thousands of pack animals, paying protection fees to regional chieftains, and navigating the complex administrative networks of the oasis garrisons. Within a few decades, the massive commercial expeditions that had crossed the Pamir Mountains and the Tarim Basin for over 15 centuries grew infrequent, replaced by the steady movement of oceanic fleets that could carry entire warehouses of cargo in a single voyage. The overland tracks, once the primary connectors of the civilized world, gradually reverted to regional transport lanes utilized only by local communities. As the grand currents of international wealth settled permanently into these oceanic channels, a deep, unhurried stillness returned to the ancient geography of the interior routes. The accounting houses, the frontier garrisons, and the sprawling desert caravans that had animated the desert margins for generations were gradually relieved of their historical burdens. The administrative records grew sparse, the ink drying on the final pages of the ledger books as the bureaucratic apparatus of the old empires receded from the borderlands. This transition marked not a sudden tragedy, but a return to a more natural, quiet rhythm of existence, where the land was no longer required to sustain the intense pressures of transcontinental commerce. The focus shifts now away from the ambitions of rulers, the calculations of merchants, and the meticulous registers of the customs clerks, moving backward into the vast, neutral landscape that outlasted them all. The great mountain passes of the Pamirs and the Tian Shan Range remained fixed against the sky, their high valleys catching the winter snows just as they did when the first envoys climbed through their icy gorges. Below these ridges, the ancient rivers continue their unhurried descents toward the interior basins, their waters spreading through the silt before dissolving into the dry sands of the lowlands. The geography rests, untroubled by the modern acceleration of time, holding the memory of countless travelers within the deep layers of its soil. Along the old northern paths of the grasslands, the seasonal winds move steadily across the open steppe, rippling the wild rye and the low scrub where the horse archers once gathered their herds. The post stations of the Yam network have long since dissolved back into the earth, leaving only faint mounds of clay and the occasional fragment of iron or bronze buried beneath the turf. No rapid couriers disrupt the long horizons, and the silence of the plain is broken only by the natural movements of wildlife and the steady rhythmic shift of the seasons. The landscape has reclaimed its ancient insulation, wrapped in a predictability that requires no human intervention to maintain its balance. Farther south, within the deep depressions of the Taklamakan, the sand dunes continue their slow, silent migrations across the abandoned tracks of the southern route, smoothing over the indentations left by centuries of camel caravans. The ruins of the mud brick watchtowers stand as solitary sentinels on the gravel flats, their sun-baked walls gradually losing their sharp geometric edges to the persistent wear of the desert wind. Inside these empty structures, the dust settles in thin, uniform layers over the remaining timbers, undisturbed by the scratching of administrative brushes or the heavy footsteps of frontier guards. The air remains dry and still, preserving the physical fragments of the past within a sanctuary of absolute quiet. Chapter 12: The Century of the Sand-Buried Ruins. Deep within the desert depressions where the ancient rivers had long ceased to flow, the physical remnants of the oasis civilizations remained preserved beneath vast blankets of hyper-arid sand. The collapse of the transcontinental caravan traffic had left these settlements isolated, their mud brick walls, irrigation gates, and public squares gradually overwhelmed by the encroaching dunes of the Taklamakan. For nearly 4 centuries, the region existed in a state of geographic suspension, removed from the immediate awareness of international political powers. This isolation guaranteed the physical survival of fragile organic artifacts that would have decayed rapidly in more humid climates, turning the abandoned stations into silent storehouses of ancient human activity. Sven Hedin, a Swedish geographer trained in precise mapping and landscape reconstruction, entered the southern rim of the desert during the final years of the 19th century with a small caravan of local guides. His expedition sought to trace the old dry river courses that had once sustained the historic settlements, utilizing barometers and surveying chains to document the changing topography of the basin. As they moved through the gravel plains, the party encountered structural timbers protruding from the sand, revealing the presence of an entirely forgotten urban center known anciently as Dandin Oilik. This discovery transformed the Western understanding of Central Asian history, proving that the desert had systematically swallowed highly developed sedentary cultures. Shifting sands consistently revealed and concealed these architectural ruins, acting as a natural, unpredictable custodian of the past. The dry, salt-crusted soil of the Tarim Basin prevented the formation of moisture-induced mold, allowing delicate decorative elements to retain their form across centuries of abandonment. Hayden's team uncovered painted stucco reliefs, fragments of woolen carpets, and wooden tablets inscribed with administrative texts that mirrored the records of the early garrisons. These findings generated significant excitement within European academic institutions, initiating a competitive phase of archaeological exploration that drew international scholars to the desert tracts. Following these initial reports, institutional interest intensified as Western museums sought to acquire the material heritage of the old silk routes to enrich their national collections. The geopolitical rivalry known as the Great Game, which pitted the British and Russian empires against one another for strategic influence in Central Asia, provided the logistical framework for these scientific expeditions. Diplomats, military officers, and scholars utilized their political networks to secure transit permits and funding, turning archaeological extraction into an extension of imperial prestige. The ancient paths were walked once more, not by merchants seeking profit, but by specialists seeking to document and remove the physical indicators of ancient cultural fluidity. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-born archaeologist working on behalf of the British Museum and the Archaeological Survey of India, organized a series of systematic expeditions that targeted the remote desert perimeters. He possessed an extraordinary capacity for long-distance desert logistics, managing large trains of pack camels and local laborers under extreme weather conditions. His methodology relied heavily on comparing the physical geography he encountered with the ancient travel logs left behind by the Chinese monk Xuanzang centuries before. By treating the old pilgrimage journal as a reliable field guide, Stein successfully located numerous sand-buried shrines, watch stations, and administrative forts along the southern route. Pinned against the sheer cliffs of the desert margins near the strategic junction of Dunhuang, the Mogao Caves emerged as the primary focus of this international archival competition. This massive complex of rock-cut Buddhist shrines, hand-carved into the gravel cliffs over a 1,000-year span, had long served as a vital spiritual sanctuary for departing and arriving caravans. While many of the larger caves remained open and active as local places of worship, a significant structural secret lay hidden behind a plastered wall within one of the corridor shrines. This sealed space, known to modern scholarship as the Library Cave, held tens of thousands of manuscripts that had been deliberately locked away during a phase of regional political instability in the early 11th century. A local Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had assumed voluntary custodianship of the neglected cliff shrines, discovered the hidden chamber while clearing accumulated sand from the lower corridors. He observed that the dry interior was packed from floor to ceiling with tight bundles of manuscript scrolls, hand-copied textiles, and ritual paintings that had remained untouched for nearly 900 years. Recognizing the spiritual and historical value of the cache, he attempted to alert local governmental officials, yet the distracted regional administration offered no resources to preserve or secure the find. When Aurel Stein arrived at the caves in 1907, he recognized the extraordinary scale of the archive and initiated a series of quiet, patient negotiations with the monk to gain access to the interior. Wrapped securely in coarse linen and silk wrappers dyed in faded indigo tones, the scrolls within the hidden room represented the largest collective cross-cultural archive of antiquity. Stein spent consecutive evenings inside the cramped space, utilizing a small candle to examine the scripts by night, while his assistants maintained a discreet watch outside the cave entrance. He selected thousands of manuscripts, including the world's oldest dated block printed text, the Diamond Sutra, and arranged to purchase them from the monk for a modest contribution to the Temple Restoration Fund. This transaction initiated the systematic dispersal of the Dunhuang Library, as subsequent international expeditions arrived to claim their own shares of the remaining materials. The intellectual significance of these recovered texts extended far beyond their spiritual utility, providing historians with an unprecedented record of the daily economic operations of the old trade routes. Among the sacred literature were thousands of secular documents, including private business contracts, water distribution schedules, marriage certificates, and medical prescriptions written by ordinary citizens. These papers revealed a highly literate, multicultural society where legal disputes were settled through written contracts and market prices were monitored by municipal councils. The dry environment of the sealed cave had functioned as an accidental time capsule, preserving the voices of the very people whose labors had sustained the overland transit network. Among the secular documents were complex multilingual phrasebooks designed to facilitate communication between foreign merchants and local municipal officials at the desert checkpoints. These small, hand-stitched booklets contained parallel columns of common vocabulary terms translated between Sogdian, Khotanese, Chinese, and Old Uyghur, focusing heavily on technical trade vocabulary regarding textile quality, animal maintenance, and credit verifications. The presence of these practical linguistic tools demonstrated that the oasis markets operated through a standardized, highly sophisticated administrative language that allowed disparate populations to negotiate contracts without violence. The margins of these pages frequently contained informal scribbles and practice characters, indicating that the acquisition of literacy was a constant requirement for advancement within the frontier bureaucracy. Paul Pelliot, a brilliant French sinologist possessing an exceptional command of classical languages, arrived at Dunhuang shortly after Stein's departure to audit the remaining manuscript bundles. Unlike his predecessor, Pelliot could read the Chinese and Central Asian scripts fluently at sight, allowing him to select the most linguistically unique and historically significant texts from the thousands that remained inside the cave. Sitting in the dim light of the chamber for weeks, he sorted through the pile with a practiced speed, identifying rare documents that shed light on the development of regional dialects and forgotten religious movements. His selection was packed into heavy wooden crates and dispatched to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, ensuring that the archive would be studied by European specialists. The linguistic diversity of the Dunhuang cache shattered the old monolithic interpretations of Asian history, revealing a level of cultural entanglement that exceeded any contemporary European context. Documents written in Hebrew scripts but composed in the Judeo-Persian language sat adjacent to Christian liturgies translated into Sogdian, while administrative edicts from the Tibetan Empire were found wrapped in silk banners bearing Sanskrit inscriptions. This material evidence proved that the Silk Road was not merely a commercial pipeline for luxury goods, but a profound intellectual solvent that dissolved the boundaries between disparate philosophical and linguistic traditions. The ruins of the desert were not dead monuments to isolation. They were the complex residues of an integrated continental intelligence. This systematic collection and removal of Central Asian artifacts provoked an enduring controversy regarding the ethics of imperial archaeology and national ownership of cultural heritage. While Western institutions argued that their interventions had saved these fragile materials from destruction, subsequent generations of historians viewed the extractions as a form of cultural displacement that divided a unified archive across distant foreign capitals. Despite these lingering debates, the international preservation of the texts catalyzed a global expansion of historical research, allowing scholars to reconstruct the complex logistics of overland trade with an accuracy that had previously been impossible. The ancient roads were mapped not as romantic legends, but as concrete systems of administration, environmental management, and human cooperation. Scholars in London, Paris, Berlin, and Kyoto spent decades unrolling, conserving, and translating the fragile paper fragments, slowly reassembling the broken threads of the transcontinental chronicle. Each translated line added a new layer of specificity to the history, replacing the vague generalities of old textbooks with the names of real merchants, the exact costs of caravan insurance, and the administrative routines of long-dead border guards. The work proceeded at a walking pace, mirroring the deliberate movement of the ancient caravans that had originally carried these papers across the interior. The preservation of the manuscripts ensured that the structural memory of Eurasia would endure, surviving long after the physical landscape had completed its reclamation of the tracks. By transferring these fragile artifacts from the dry sands of the desert into the climate-controlled vaults of global institutions, the physical survival of the record was guaranteed for future generations. Yet, as the individual documents were cataloged, numbered, and sealed behind glass, they ceased to function as living components of an active regional landscape, becoming instead static objects of historical analysis. The transition marked the final phase of the Silk Road's long journey, moving from the active fluidity of international commerce to the quiet stillness of institutional memory. This institutional preservation set the stage for a final assessment of how these ancient movements continued to influence the structural geography of the modern world as the narrative turned toward the enduring echoes that lingered within the soil itself. Chapter 13: The Modern Echoes and the Deep Baseline. As the political maps of Eurasia underwent further transformations during the industrial era, the foundational lines drawn by the ancient caravan tracks proved remarkably resilient. Early railway planners, seeking to connect distant maritime ports with the interior markets of the continent, quickly discovered that the optimal routes had already been cleared centuries prior by the movements of nomadic pastoralists and imperial frontier guards. The natural topography of the continent, characterized by narrow mountain passes and predictable river valleys, left little room for alternative choices, forcing modern engineers to retrace the exact paths that had carried the first bales of mulberry silk. This continuity demonstrated that the ancient trade network was not an arbitrary creation of human history, but a logical adaptation to the physical geography of the earth. Across the narrow defiles of the Hindu Kush and the high shelves of the Pamir Mountains, modern telecommunication teams frequently encountered the old masonry foundations of ancient watch stations while installing transcontinental telegraph cables. During the construction of the Indo-European telegraph line in the late 19th century, workers under the direction of engineering logs noted that the most stable locations for their timber poles corresponded exactly with the ruined towers of the old Sasanian and Sogdian courier systems. These ancient builders had selected the highest, most visible promontories to ensure clear sight lines for smoke signals, providing the modern crews with an already optimized network of relay stations. The placement of the new copper wires followed the exact path of the old horse trails, linking the capital cities of Europe and Asia through a modern electrical current that mirrored the old paths of administrative intelligence. International boundary commissions, tasked with delineating the borders of modern nation-states in Central Asia, consistently relied upon the historical jurisdictions of the old oasis kingdoms to settle complex territorial claims. The archival records of the regional emirates, which tracked land leases and water distribution rights based on ancient administrative precedents, provided the essential legal documentation needed to draw permanent lines on modern topographical maps. These historic property definitions survived decades of political realignment, ensuring that the geographic identities of cities like Samarkand, Kashgar, and Khotan remained anchored in their ancient roles as trade hubs. The lines drawn by modern diplomats often reflected the old agreements negotiated by frontier protectors and local merchant councils centuries before. By placing steel rails and heavy stone ballast over the old desert tracks, industrial builders transformed the velocity of continental transit without altering its fundamental geometry. The construction of the Trans-Caspian and Orenburg railways during the late 19th and early 20th centuries allowed for the rapid movement of industrial commodities. Yet the trains stopped at the exact oasis stations that had watered the Bactrian camels for generations. Urban centers that had experienced a long phase of economic isolation following the rise of maritime trade experienced a sudden revival of infrastructure investment, their storage yards filled once more with foreign goods. The mechanical rhythm of the locomotives integrated with the seasonal movements of the local populations, creating a hybrid landscape where ancient mud brick walls sat adjacent to modern repair shops. A documented instance of this material continuity occurred during the survey of the southern rim of the Taklamakan Desert by British mapping teams under the supervision of Colonel Sir Thomas Holditch. While verifying the coordinates of an old dry riverbed near the ruins of Nia, the surveyors uncovered a series of ancient wooden marker posts that had been used by Han Dynasty road engineers to calculate distances between the frontier courier stations. Holditch noted in his official field log that the ancient measurements displayed an extraordinary mathematical precision, matching the modern satellite and chain surveys within a fraction of a mile. The team utilized these ancient markers to stabilize their own geographic reference frames, demonstrating that the technical achievements of the early frontier administration remained useful to modern cartographers. Not all elements of the ancient infrastructure transitioned smoothly into the industrial era, as many specialized trades and seasonal routines vanished completely with the disappearance of the pack animal economies. The complex networks of camel breeders, harness makers, and traditional caravan leaders, whose unwritten knowledge of desert survival had sustained the routes for 15 centuries, receded into obscurity as mechanized transport became the standard. Warehouses that had been designed to stable hundreds of draft horses were converted into fuel depots, and the ancient art of navigating by the stars was replaced by the mechanical certainty of the compass and the clock. This material transformation altered the daily life of the oasis communities, replacing an old culture of patient transit with the rapid requirements of modern supply chains. Within the isolated mountain valleys of Tajikistan and the rugged gorges of the upper Oxus River, the linguistic legacy of the ancient merchants persisted in small communities that retained archaic dialects of the old Eastern Iranian tongues. Linguists visiting these remote settlements discovered that the local population spoke a form of the Sogdian language that had survived nearly unchanged since the height of the transcontinental trade network. These isolated speakers utilized technical terms for agricultural management, water rights, and textile weaving that matched the inscriptions found on the parchment fragments of the Dunhuang Library cave. The survival of this language provided researchers with a living connection to the human fabric of the old roots, proving that the human voice could outlast the stone architecture of empires. Large deposits of industrial minerals and petroleum, discovered deep beneath the dry basins of the Tarim and Caspian seas, drew a new generation of extraction specialists to the ancient oasis corridors during the middle decades of the 20th century. The extraction of these subsurface resources required the construction of extensive pipeline networks and modern heavy highways, projects that followed the exact low-altitude paths utilized by the ancient spice and silk caravans. Cities that had once derived their prosperity from taxing luxury textiles transformed into energy hubs, their populations expanding rapidly to support the new extraction industries. The material wealth of the interior was no longer carried in leather bags on the backs of pack animals, but flowed continuously through steel tubes buried beneath the gravel flats. With the revival of interest in transcontinental infrastructure during the early 21st century, massive state-sponsored construction initiatives systematically expanded the old overland corridors. This modernization project, explicitly framed around the historical memory of the ancient silk routes, led to the investment of billions of dollars in high-speed rail lines, automated logistics depots, and international deep-water ports. The new concrete highways bypassed the old mountain bottlenecks, yet they linked the exact commercial nodes that had been established by the early Han, Tang, and Mongol administrations. This deliberate reconstruction demonstrated that the geopolitical necessity of linking the economic centers of the East and the West remained an enduring reality of continental governance. Following the paths of the old northern route through the Dzungarian Gate, modern container trains covered the immense distance between the industrial centers of East Asia and the markets of Western Europe in less than 2 weeks. These massive trains carrying electronics, manufactured components, and industrial equipment moved continuously day and night, their schedules managed by centralized computers and automated signaling systems. The movement of these goods was no longer subject to the arbitrary exactions of local warlords or the seasonal changes of water holes. yet the efficiency of the transit depended on the same geographic continuity that had sustained the Pax Mongolica. The modern container had become the equivalent of the ancient silk bale, a standardized unit of global wealth moving across a unified continent. Specialized international heritage frameworks emerged to protect the surviving physical monuments of the trade lanes, designating ancient watchtowers, caves, and fortresses as protected sites of global significance. This institutional preservation sought to stabilize the fragile structures against the wear of modern tourism and industrial development, ensuring that the material record of transcontinental cooperation remained accessible to future generations. Teams of conservators utilized advanced chemical stabilizers to protect the delicate frescoes of the Dunhuang caves and reinforced the rammed earth walls of the Jade Gate with local clay mixtures. These efforts transformed the old border checkpoints into historical monuments, shifting their function from active administrative tools to static symbols of global heritage. Today, thick layers of modern asphalt cover long segments of the Hexi corridor, insulating the fragile earthworks of the Han Dynasty from the immediate wear of industrial traffic. Travelers moving through the region see the ancient beacon towers rising like weathered clay fingers from the modern roadside ditches, their geometric shapes softened by centuries of wind erosion. The juxtaposition of high-speed trains and ancient rammed earth walls creates a visible timeline of human movement, showing how each successive generation utilized the same narrow shelf of arable soil to project its influence across the continent. The land retains these overlapping layers of history, presenting a complex archive of human ambition etched directly into the topography. Beyond the edges of these modern transport lanes, the vast interior geography of Asia continues to operate according to its own ancient, unhurried rhythms. The great sand dunes of the Taklamakan move slowly across the abandoned sectors of the old southern route, covering the remaining traces of the ancient wells and smoothing over the gravel flats where the caravans once rested. The air within these deep desert wastes remains hot and dry, preserving the silence that returned to the interior after the migration of wealth to the sea lanes. The modern world recedes at the boundary of the sands, leaving the heart of the continent to maintain its ancient insulation from the acceleration of human time. The high alpine meadows of the Tian Shan Range receive their seasonal blankets of snow with a steady predictability that remains indifferent to the changing patterns of human commerce. The glaciers continue their slow, imperceptible movements down the rocky slopes, feeding the mountain streams that have sustained the oasis settlements since the first tracks were pressed into the frontier sand. The passes through which the monks, envoys, and merchants climbed are quiet now, their narrow pathways cleared of regular traffic and returned to the custody of the cold wind. The peaks stand as silent witnesses to the long-distance movements that once linked the continents, holding the memory of countless travelers within their eternal ice layers. Below the silent peaks, the ancient riverbeds carry their seasonal meltwater down toward the dry terminal lakes of the interior basins, their currents slowing as they reach the wide gravel plains. The water spreads through the silt before dissolving into the dry sands of the lowlands, completing its seasonal cycle without human intervention or administrative regulation. The old channels remain visible from the air as delicate branching lines drawn across the earth, tracking the historical geography of a landscape that provided the essential matrix for transcontinental cooperation. The flow is steady and unhurried, reflecting a time before maps defined the edges of our world. The wind moves steadily across the gravel plains, smoothing over the final traces of the day's movement and leaving the landscape in a condition of absolute rest. The long roads have faded into the earth, leaving only the steady movement of the air over the dry lake beds and the cold stone of the ridges. The ink has dried on the final pages of the ledger books, the balances have settled, and the landscape remains wide, patient, and completely still. The day's long transit has ended, and the tracks in the sand are gathered into the quiet hours of the evening. The journey is complete. Rest well,